The night Nadia Cole's life changed, she was running. She had been running most of her life, in one way or another, from group homes that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and quiet hopelessness, from caseworkers who shuffled her paperwork with the mechanical focus of people who processed files rather than futures, from a grief she could never fully name because it belonged to a mother she had barely known and a father whose name she had never been given. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. But this kind of running, the physical kind, with cracked asphalt under her sneakers and her lungs tearing apart, and three men's footsteps amplifying behind her in the narrow corridor of a side street, felt different. More immediate, more real than any of the slower emergencies she had been navigating for the past 20 years of her life. She had left the diner at 11:45 with $62 in her jacket pocket. Tips from a double shift she'd picked up because Sandra from the afternoon crew had called out sick and Nadia needed every dollar she could hold on to. She'd been walking the 11 blocks back to the shelter on Deacon Street, her feet aching in shoes that had been separating at the left sole for 3 weeks, and which she'd been repairing with electrical tape scavenged from behind the diner's supply closet. The street had been mostly quiet, a few passing cars, the yellow light of a late-night bodega pressing against the pavement, a man singing something softly and indistinctly to himself outside a shuttered laundromat. She had noticed them at the corner of 5th and Ralston. 3 men, late 20s or early 30s, standing in that particular way that was not quite natural, angled away from the streetlight rather than drawn toward it the way people stood when they were simply waiting. One of them had said something she didn't catch, and when she sped up without responding, she heard their rhythm change. That shift from casual to purposeful was something she recognized the way other people recognized weather turning. Years of navigating shelters, group home dormitories, and streets at uncertain hours had given her a specific literacy for danger, and everything her body understood told her to move. She turned right off Ralston, then left into an alley she half remembered from walking this route in daylight. The footsteps behind her changed pitch on the turn. Closer. She ran through the alley and came out on the far side into a wide, unlit stretch of industrial ground she didn't recognize from the daytime. The shelter route went left on Ralston, not right. She'd gone the wrong direction. The fencing along the edge of the open lot was chain link, rusted, with one section near the ground where something heavy had pressed it flat against the dirt years ago, and it had never been lifted back. She didn't think. She dropped to her knees and scrambled through, feeling the wire snag her jacket, tearing it at the shoulder seam with a clean rip as she pulled free. She ran across the open ground. Her feet found broken concrete and dry weeds and the crumbled edge of what had once been a loading platform. Ahead, in the darkness, shapes emerged from the night, large, angular shapes, sitting low to the ground on parallel rails that caught the faint ambient glow from the highway overpass in the distance. She had run into the Hartwell Rail Yard. The men stopped at the fence. One of them swore loudly. Another spoke in a low, urgent tone she couldn't make out. She didn't wait to hear more. She moved deeper into the yard, threading between the hulking shadows of freight cars arranged in long silent rows on their rusted tracks, their surfaces furred with age and oxidation, their painted markings faded to pale suggestions of what they had once said. She didn't stop moving until she was certain she'd put at least 200 feet of darkness between herself and the fence. Then she pressed her back against the side of a freight car and listened. Wind, low and wandering. Somewhere beyond the overpass, a truck. Her own breathing. The men's voices, retreating now, diminishing. Then nothing but the yard. They hadn't followed. She stood there for a long time, back against cold steel, $62 in her jacket pocket, the ripped seam at her shoulder letting in the October air. She was shaking, though she couldn't have said with certainty whether it was fear or cold, or the specific kind of exhaustion that came from being vigilant every hour of every day with nowhere to truly rest. She'd been carrying that exhaustion for 2 years, for months, and 11 days since the Maplewood group home had processed her exit paperwork on her 18th birthday with the same procedural efficiency with which it had processed her intake 11 years earlier. A folder had closed. A number had been removed from a caseload. A girl had been handed $40 in transitional assistance, a photocopied list of social services numbers, and the specific silence of a door that doesn't open again from the outside. She had not been ready. But readiness was something distributed unevenly in the world she'd been born into, and Nadia had understood this long before she had words for it. Some people arrived in the world with warm houses and parents who made mistakes but tried hard, and a general assumption that tomorrow would resemble today in manageable ways. Nadia had arrived or been deposited into a world where nothing was guaranteed past the next 30 days of shelter placement, and she had learned early that hoping for more than that was a specific cruelty you could inflict on yourself if you weren't careful. Her mother, Lisa Cole, had died from a brain aneurysm in their small apartment on Gresham Avenue when Nadia was 6 years old. Nadia had been the one who found her. She had been sitting on the kitchen floor beside her mother for nearly 2 hours before the neighbor downstairs, a heavy-set man named Mr. Okafor, who kept odd hours and watched television at low volume late into the night, had heard something and called the building super. The memory had blurred over the years the way certain kinds of pain mercifully softened, the edges going imprecise with time, but the feeling of it, the particular cold stillness of a room where something has gone irreversibly wrong, had never left. Her father was a question she had stopped asking by the time she was 10. There had been no relatives willing or able to take her. A great-aunt in Cleveland had been contacted and had not returned the call. A name appearing on an emergency contacts form had turned out to belong to a woman who had moved 3 years prior and left no forwarding address. So Nadia had entered the system with the compliance of a child who had no other options, and the system had done what it did. It had processed her. She had lived in 6 different placements over 12 years. Some had been better than others in ways that mattered enormously. The Hendersons in Murfreesboro had been genuinely kind people who had already raised 3 biological children and had room in both their house and their hearts for a quiet, watchful girl with deep trust issues and a habit of cataloging the nearest exits in any room she entered. She had lived with them from age 9 to 12, and those 3 years remained the nearest thing to a foundation she had ever stood on. Mr. Henderson was a high school football coach who never raised his voice, who taught her to play chess on winter afternoons, who checked her homework with genuine interest and called her work good when it was good and told her specifically what needed improvement when it didn't. Mrs. Henderson made Sunday dinners that lasted 2 hours and involved arguing about the food in the warm way of a family that argued about things because they were comfortable together and not because anything was wrong. Nadia had learned, in that house, what it felt like to have her presence assumed rather than tolerated. Then Mr. Henderson had been transferred for work, a promotion, a new city, a whole new life that had no structural mechanism for including a foster child, and the placement had ended, and she had been moved again, and the kindness she had banked during those 3 years had spent down slowly over the placements that followed, like drawing from an account with no way to replenish it. After the Hendersons, there had been a couple in Clarksville who had meant well, but were overwhelmed and communicated this mostly through a particular exhausted silence that Nadia learned to read accurately. There had been a group home placement in Nashville, a large, noisy facility where the staff worked rotating shifts and continuity was a structural impossibility, and where Nadia had learned to be invisible as a survival mechanism. There had been a woman named Patricia Reeves who had fostered children for 20 years and who had liked Nadia well enough, but had clearly been coasting toward retirement rather than investing in new connections. And there had been, finally, Maplewood, where she had spent her last 3 years in the system in a building that was neither cruel nor kind, simply institutional, a place that processed youth rather than raised it. By 16, she had learned to expect little. By 17, she had stopped expecting anything. By 18, she had learned to survive. Survival looked like this: a job, usually 2. One legitimate, one cash. She had worked at diners, car washes, a warehouse packing holiday orders during the November rush, a parking garage on the night shift where the hours were slow and the booth was heated and she could read. She had slept at the shelter on Deacon Street when there was a bed, at the Women's Resource Center on Maynard when Deacon was full, twice in the 24-hour laundromat on Vine when everything else was either taken or unsafe. She had learned which churches ran meal programs and on which days. She had learned which shelter staff members were bureaucratic and which were human. She had learned that the emergency number for Tennessee's transitional housing assistance had an average hold time of 47 minutes and resulted in a case assignment that took 8 to 12 weeks, and that in the meantime, you needed to already know where you were sleeping. She had been saving. That was the thing that nobody who hadn't lived it fully understood about the kind of poverty that left no margin, that saving was not passive accumulation. It was a daily act of discipline and denial and faith, a constant weighing of necessities against each other, a continuous negotiation between the version of you who needed to eat today and the version of you who needed a door with a lock someday. Nadia had $847 in a savings account accessed through a prepaid card. She needed $1,200 for first month and deposit on the cheapest room she had found that was within walking distance of the diner. The room was in a house on Eckhart Street, rented by a woman named Mrs. Parson who had listed it on a community board at the branch library and who had been patient when Nadia had explained her situation. No rental history, no references beyond a shelter intake worker, with the straightforward honesty of someone who had nothing to hide and no energy left for performance. $353 from something that resembled stability. And now she was standing in an abandoned rail yard at midnight, shaking, ripped jacket, electrical tape shoes, $62 in her pocket. She let herself slide down the side of the freight car until she was sitting on the ground, back against the steel, palms flat against the cold dirt. She breathed deliberately, the way the counselor at Maplewood had taught her for a few months before moving on to a different position and being replaced by someone who ran group sessions about conflict resolution and never asked Nadia a single personal question. The yard settled around her. Wind worked through the open structure of it, carrying rust smell and the faint chemical note of highway diesel from the overpass. Somewhere in the darkness, something small, a cat or a possum, rustled through dead weeds beside the nearest rail. Above her, the sky was clear and the stars were the washed-out version. You got this close to a city, pale suggestions of the thing rather than the thing itself. She was not going back through that fence tonight. Not until daylight. The thought arrived not as defeat, but as a practical decision. Her phone was cracked and nearly out of charge, and the shelter would be locked for the night anyway. She would find somewhere in the yard to sit out the remaining hours until dawn. She had been in worse situations than this. She knew how to make herself small and wait. She began walking slowly along the row of freight cars, not looking for anything in particular, just moving to stay warm. Most of the cars she passed were rusted past usefulness, doors missing, sides buckled, while trucks collapsed onto the rails. This was not an operational yard. Nothing here had moved in a very long time. The Hartwell Rail Yard had not always been what she was walking through. In its time, it had been a significant node in Tennessee's freight infrastructure, 43 acres on the southwestern edge of the city, processing agricultural shipments, manufactured goods, coal from the eastern coal fields, building materials for the post-war construction boom that had reshaped the region in the 1950s and 1960s. At its peak in 1961, the yard had employed 214 people across 3 shifts. There had been a maintenance shed capable of servicing 6 locomotives at once, a weighbridge station known throughout the district for its accuracy, and a small administrative building at the far end of the yard with a clock tower whose face still showed, its hands long since removed or fallen. The yard had had its own social world, a canteen, a union hall, a baseball team that played in the Nashville Industrial League from 1948 until 1979. The railroad company Hartwell and Southern Rail had gone into receivership in 1987, a casualty of the national freight rail contraction that had been underway for 2 decades. The yard had passed through 2 subsequent owners and 2 subsequent bankruptcies, sitting in legal and financial limbo that the county had never resolved, collecting no tax revenue while also spending nothing on the land. 43 acres of silence and rust, fenced on 3 sides, backed against the eastern bank of a drainage canal on the 4th. None of this was information Nadia Cole possessed as she walked between the dead freight cars that October night. She knew only what her eyes told her, a place the world had finished with. She understood that kind of abandonment in a specific way. She was somewhere in the middle of the 4th row of cars when she found the one that was different. It sat between 2 open-framed flat cars whose wooden decking had rotted away to bare skeleton. It was a boxcar, a fully enclosed freight car with sliding doors on both sides, and at first glance, nothing distinguished it from the others she'd passed. Same faded paint, same rust incrustation at the roofline, same weeds pushing up around the wheel trucks. But when Nadia put her hand against its side to steady herself on the uneven ground, something registered that didn't fit. The steel under her palm was colder than it should have been. Not the ordinary cold of metal on an October night. This was a different quality, the cold of depth, the temperature differential of sealed space rather than a shell. She had spent enough time pressed against poorly insulated walls, lying on thin mattresses in inadequately heated rooms, to know the difference between surface cold and mass cold. This was mass cold, the suggestion of sealed volume behind the steel. She moved along the car's length, pressing her palm flat at intervals, checking the consistency of what she felt. At the far end, near the door, she stopped. Something else, faint enough that she wasn't sure at first, a vibration. Not mechanical, not the shudder of nearby traffic. Internal. She pressed her ear to the steel and held it there. Silence. And then, at the very edge of silence, something, a faint exhalation, too regular to be settling, too low to be accidental. Something running inside this car. Something that had been running long enough to become unremarkable to itself. She stepped back and looked at the door. The sliding door on a standard freight car ran on a top rail and secured with a simple drop-pin latch, the kind opened with one hand. The door on this car was different in one specific way. When she examined the latch mechanism, she found it wasn't a drop-pin at all. It was a padlock housing, and not an old one. The lock body was the same surface color as the surrounding rust, the same texture, but when her fingers closed around it, the metal felt different. Denser. More recently treated. Someone had disguised a modern, functioning lock to look like it belonged to 40-year-old abandoned equipment. Nadia stood still in the dark for a long moment, her hand still resting on the lock. She was 20 years old, homeless, $62 in her pocket. She had run into a dead-end yard to avoid 3 men who wanted to hurt her, and she had found something she did not understand in the middle of a place the city had written off. She could feel the pull of it the way you felt the pull of a door slightly ajar, not curiosity exactly, but a gravity, the specific weight of recognizing something that was wrong in a way that might also be right. She had no tools, no particular expertise with locks. What she had was times 6 hours until dawn, possibly more, and the practical intelligence of someone who had learned to be resourceful because no one was coming to solve her problems for her. She examined the car from every angle. The main door was beyond her without tools, but a freight car had more than one access point. She worked around the full perimeter, hands running along every surface, checking for anything that gave differently under pressure. At the far end of the car, near the roofline, she found a small service hatch, the type used for ventilation and emergency entry, whose hinge bolts had worked loose from the frame over years of thermal expansion. The hatch itself was still latched, but the frame it was latched to had separated from the car wall by nearly an inch along its bottom edge. She'd been carrying a length of rebar since the second row of cars, 18 inches, picked up from the ground without thinking, held the way you held something that might be useful or might be a weapon depending on what the next 10 minutes required. She worked it into the gap at the bottom of the hatch frame and pressed. The metal resisted, then groaned. Then, with a sound that seemed enormous in the yard's stillness, gave. The hatch swung outward on its remaining hinge, and what came out hit her before she could look inside. Cold air. Not fresh cold. Sealed cold, the kind that had been unchanged for a long time. And beneath it, barely detectable, a trace of machine oil and something that reminded her of the archive room at the branch library, where old newspapers sat on microfiche reels, and the air held the specific weight of documents too important to destroy, but too old to be actively useful. She climbed onto the wheel truck assembly and pulled herself through the hatch. Dropped down into darkness. The phone's flashlight was modest at best. Cracked screen, battery down to 12%. She switched it on anyway and let the beam move across the interior of the car. She had expected emptiness. Maybe old freight, debris, the miscellaneous accumulation of abandoned space. What she saw was so orderly that it stopped her cold. The interior of the car had been partitioned. Not improvised, not the rough division of someone storing things without a plan, but deliberately, with the precision of someone who had designed this space to serve a specific purpose and had executed that design with care. The rear third of the car was separated from the front by a wall of wooden crating that reached the ceiling, each section secured to the car's interior structural ribs with hardware she couldn't fully identify in the dim light, but which was clearly permanent. The wood showed no rot, no moisture damage, no insect damage. Whatever was on the other side of that partition had been protected with intention. The front 2/3 of the car, the section she'd landed and held, something she spent a long time looking at. Along both walls ran shelves, metal, bolted directly to the car's frame, and on those shelves sat rows of steel cases. Small, rectangular, the kind used for sensitive documents or archival equipment. Each one numbered. Each one closed. She counted. 14 cases on the left side. 16 on the right. Numbered sequentially, 001 through 030. The labels visible in the beam of her phone. She touched the nearest case. Its surface was cool, but dust-free. Not wiped down today, but wiped down. Recently maintained or sealed in a way that prevented accumulation. Her phone battery was at 10%. She needed to be careful. She moved along the shelves slowly, touching each case lightly, reading the numbers, looking for any other markings. Most had only the sequential number. Case 012 had a small secondary label she couldn't read in the angle of light. Case 019 had a corner dent that looked like it had been dropped once and then carefully replaced. Case 024 had a strip of tape over part of its latch that was newer than the case itself, a repair from some time more recent. She was on the right side of the shelf, crouching to examine a lower case, when she found it. Case 007. In the upper right corner of the label slot, beneath the case number, affixed with the same label maker as all the others, a secondary line of text. She raised the phone and read it twice to be certain. Cole family documentation and legal. Her breath left her body in one long, involuntary exhale. She stayed exactly as she was crouched, phone raised, the beam steady on the label, and she did not move for nearly a full minute. Cole was her name. Her mother's name. Her name. The only name she had ever had, because foster care intake forms needed a surname, and Lisa Cole's daughter had no other claim to one. It was not an uncommon name. There were Coles in every city, in every state in the country. A label in a locked freight car in an abandoned rail yard reading Cole family was not, by any logical sequence of reasoning, necessarily connected to her. She knew all of this. She was not a person who reasoned poorly under pressure, the opposite. If anything, years of situations where clear thinking was the difference between outcomes had made her practical in ways that went deep. And yet, she sat down on the floor of the car, back against the shelving unit, and held the phone against her chest with the flashlight off to preserve the remaining battery. In the darkness, she let herself absorb what she'd found. Not just the label, the whole of it, the disguised lock, the maintained cases, the sealed cold, the partition that concealed something she hadn't yet accessed. Someone had built this. Someone was checking it every 6 to 8 weeks. Someone had labeled one of 30 cases with the words Cole family. She had her mother's name and nothing else. Lisa Cole. A single photograph. Her mother at 23, laughing at someone outside the frame. Her face full of a joy Nadia had spent years trying to reconstruct. A birth certificate with the father's line left blank. The memory of a kitchen floor and the specific silence that followed. She had been told, more than once, that her mother had no known family and her father had never come forward. She had accepted this the way you accepted most of the facts of your life when you had no power to change them. She had accepted it. She had not stopped being curious about it. Battery at 8%. She turned the light on again and went to work. She photographed every case on both shelves, working quickly and methodically, the same way she'd once photographed her belongings before checking out of a shelter. She photographed the partition wall, the hardware securing it, the hatch she'd come through, the floor, the ceiling, the overall layout of the space. On the wall near the hatch she'd missed earlier, a clipboard hung from a small hook, a maintenance log, she realized, scanning it. Dates going back several years. A check mark beside each entry, each signed with the same initial. The entries were spaced 6 to 8 weeks apart, regular as appointments. The most recent was dated 11 days ago. 6% battery. She put the phone away. She was not going to open case 007 tonight. The combination lock built into the lid was a 3-dial mechanism she could feel in the dark, but not crack, without time and light and more attempts than her current situation allowed. She was not going to force the partition tonight. She was not going to take anything from the car, and she was not going to do anything she couldn't undo. What she was going to do was understand this space as completely as she could with what she had, leave it as close to undisturbed as possible, and come back. 6 to 8 weeks between check-ins. 11 days since the last one. She had time. She made herself go back to the partition. The wood was dense oak or something close, carefully fitted, each edge jointed rather than nailed, each joint tight enough that she couldn't get her fingernail into the seam. The hardware was stainless steel, hex-bolted to the car's ribs, security drive bolts that resisted improvised removal. She worked along the full length of the partition twice, pressing every inch, checking every junction. At the second pass, at approximately waist height on the left side near where the partition met the car wall, she found a section that gave under pressure barely 2 or 3 millimeters, but consistently, across a section 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall. Not a hinge in the conventional sense. A pressure release, maybe. A hidden catch. She pressed it from different angles, with different combinations of force and finger placement, for nearly 20 minutes. On her 7th attempt, pressing her palm firmly into the upper right corner of the section, while simultaneously pulling at the edge of the adjacent panel with her fingertips, she felt something give. Not dramatically. A small, precise release, a cabinet catch yielding, and a section of the partition shifted inward by a 1/4 inch along one edge, opening a gap of darkness that breathed sealed air across her fingers. The smell that came through was older than anything else in the car. Colder. More dense. Not decay, not rot or moisture or the smell of things that had gone wrong. The opposite. The smell of things that had been preserved. Metal and dry paper and something she couldn't name. Something mineral. Something with a weight to it that reached past smell into the lower registers of instinct. She held the panel exactly as it was and made herself stop. She did not open it further. She did not push through. She stood in the dark of a sealed freight car in an abandoned rail yard with her hand in a gap in a hidden panel, and she felt the full weight of what this moment was, or might be, pressing on her chest like a held breath. She had a dead phone and rebar and $62. She had a maintenance log showing 6 to 8 week intervals between check-ins, with the last one 11 days ago. She had 30 numbered cases and her family name on one of them. She had a hidden panel that opened when you pressed the right corner in the right sequence. And on the other side of that panel, sealed in cold and darkness, was something that had been put there specifically, not abandoned, not forgotten, not left by accident, but placed with intent and maintained with care and protected with a disguised lock and a monitoring schedule that someone had kept up for years. She let the panel close, felt the catch re-engage with a soft, precise click. She backed away slowly to the far wall and sat down and breathed. Outside, a vehicle moved through the yard, not on the highway, closer. She heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of an engine running low and deliberate on hard ground rather than road. Then headlights swept through the hatch gap and across the upper wall of the car's interior, a brief, sweeping blaze of light. She killed her body language before she killed anything else, went completely still, pressed herself flat against the wall below the shelf level. The vehicle stopped. An engine idled. A door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel. One set, unhurried, purposeful, the movement of someone checking something they expected to be undisturbed rather than searching for a problem. She tracked the sound as it moved along the car's exterior. Along the north side, toward the front. A pause at the main door. The specific sound of a hand testing a lock. Metal on metal, brief and practiced. A pause. Then the footsteps moved away. Back to the vehicle. Door. Engine moving. The headlights swept again, retreating, until she could no longer hear anything at all. She held her position for 5 full minutes. Then 5 more. Someone was monitoring this car. Not with the indifference of a general security sweep, with the specific attention of someone confirming a thing they were responsible for was still secure. The stop at the main door. The lock check. The brief metal-on-metal sound of a practiced inspection. This was a person who came to check a specific car, verified a specific lock, and left. They had not checked the hatch. They had not noticed the hatch because the bent frame she had pried open was pressed back into something resembling its original position. And in the dark, from a casual exterior pass with a flashlight, it looked like the rest of the car's surface corroded, immovable, long past useful. She had until the next check. Nadia sat in the dark and thought with the particular clarity that came from knowing you had no one to defer the thinking to. No caseworker to consult, no parent to call, no institutional structure to refer the decision upward to. Just herself and whatever she could work out from what she knew. What she knew. Someone maintained this car actively. Someone had installed a modern lock behind the appearance of abandonment. Someone had built custom shelving and filled it with 30 numbered cases and maintained them in a condition that suggested ongoing care. Someone had built a hidden partition concealing something she hadn't yet seen. And someone had labeled one of those cases with the name of the family she had no information about. What she did not know who. Why? What was inside the partition? What was inside case 007? Whether the label meant her family specifically or some other Cole family entirely. Whether finding out would change anything or whether it was just another thing that had her name attached to it and nothing else. She had learned, early, not to invest hope in things that weren't confirmed. But she had also learned the Hendersons had taught her this without ever articulating it directly, that the difference between surviving and living was the willingness to take seriously the thing that might matter, rather than protecting yourself by deciding in advance that it probably didn't. She turned the flashlight on one more time, 6%, then 5, and looked at case 007 long enough to make certain she had not misread it. Cole family documentation and legal. She had not misread it. She turned the phone off. Dawn took a long time. Light came through the hatch gap in increments, gray first, then pale, then stronger, filling the car's interior from above at a low oblique angle that caught the steel cases on the shelves and gave them a pale gleam. She looked at them in the morning light, and they looked the same as they had in the dark, except that the light made them more specific, more real, more definitely not a thing she had imagined. She stood up, tucked the rebar into her jacket, and climbed back through the hatch. She pressed the bent frame back into position from outside, pushing at the edge with careful, even pressure until the gap closed and the surface looked, from any reasonable distance, like the rest of the car's exterior. She dropped to the ground, stood in the October morning, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The rail yard stretched in every direction, dead cars, dead rails, dead weeds bent by dead weather. The administrative building at the far end had its clock face blank where the hands had been. The maintenance shed's walls still stood, but the roof had partially collapsed, leaving a ragged open section through which the morning sky was visible. The weighbridge station was a concrete pad with rusted anchor bolts where equipment had once been bolted down. Everything the city had finished with. She walked back through the yard to the flattened fence section, went through on her knees, stood on the street side, and brushed the dirt off her jacket as best she could. The street was ordinary in the morning. A garbage truck working its route 3 blocks over. A woman walking a dog. The bodega she'd noticed last night, now properly open, with a teenager restocking the display of bottled drinks in the window. Deacon Street Shelter had breakfast service until 8. She had 40 minutes. She started walking. She had $62 and a ripped jacket and shoes held together with tape, and she was $353 from a room with a lock on the door. She had $847 in savings and a double shift in 6 hours and feet that ached with every step. She also had 30 photographs on a dying phone and a name on a case and a hidden panel that opened when you pressed the right corner and a maintenance schedule that gave her time she hadn't had yesterday. She did not yet know what was on the other side of that partition. She did not yet know whose name appeared in the yard's legal records, or who was checking the lock on that car, or why someone had built something so deliberate in a place the world believed had been left to collapse. She did not know whether the answer to the question she had stopped asking at age 10 was somehow contained inside a sealed freight car in the middle of 43 abandoned acres of Tennessee ground. But she was going to find out. She had been running for 20 years. She was not running anymore. She went back to the diner 6 hours after leaving the rail yard and worked a full shift without saying a word about any of it to anyone. This was not difficult. Nadia had spent most of her life holding things close, calibrating carefully what she let out and to whom, and the discipline of that the practiced containment was so automatic by now that even something as large as what she had found in the Hartwell Rail Yard compressed into a small, quiet pressure behind her sternum that she could carry through 8 hours of carrying plates and refilling coffee and smiling at customers who did not think about what her life looked like between shifts. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. She had 2 priorities in the days immediately after the discovery. The first was to get her phone charged and the photographs transferred somewhere more permanent before the device died, or was stolen, or simply gave out, as cracked pay-as-you-go phones had a tendency to do. The second was to go to the public library. The phone she handled first. The diner had a charging strip behind the counter that the staff used for personal devices, and Nadia plugged in during her prep shift the next morning and sat close enough to keep an eye on it while she rolled silverware and restocked the condiment station. When the battery reached 60%, she took it to the library branch on Maynard Avenue, the one with the computer terminals and the patient librarian named Mr. Osei, who had helped her navigate the county's housing assistance portal 6 months ago, and who never asked her why she needed so much help with administrative tasks, and she emailed all 31 photographs to a free account she set up specifically for this purpose, using an address that contained none of her identifying information. Then she sat down at one of the terminals and began to search. She started with what she had: Hartwell Rail Yard, Nashville, Tennessee, history. The results were sparse but coherent. Local history databases, a few academic papers on Tennessee freight infrastructure, a digitized archive of the Nashville banner from the 1940s through the 1980s. She worked through them methodically, the way she had learned to research things at school when the school library had been the only library she had access to, building from general to specific, looking for the thread that led somewhere useful. The yard had been founded in 1923. She almost passed over that sentence, a single line in a county planning archive summary, but something stopped her. She went back and read it again. Founded 1923, Hartwell and Southern Rail. Principal owner James Earl Cole, Nashville. She stayed very still in the plastic library chair. She typed James Earl Cole into the search field and waited. The results came back in a slow cascade. A brief mention in a 1944 Nashville Banner article about the yard's wartime freight contributions. James Cole, proprietor of Hartwell and Southern, credited with maintaining schedule despite wartime labor shortages. A 1953 Chamber of Commerce listing with a photograph, too small and too poor in quality to read faces clearly, showing a group of men at a yard expansion ceremony, with Cole among them. A 1961 Labor Day piece about the yard's employment record, and in a 1972 obituary from the Banner's digitized archives, a paragraph that made the room tilt slightly around her. James Earl Cole, age 77, founder and proprietor of Hartwell and Southern Rail, died at his home on March 14th. He is survived by his son, Robert James Cole, and his grandchildren. Cole founded the yard in 1923 following his service in the First World War and built it into one of the region's most significant freight operations over 5 decades. He was known for his treatment of his workforce and his commitment to the local community. His son, Robert James Cole. She had never been told that name. She had never been told any name on her father's side, assuming Robert Cole was on her father's side, assuming any of this connected to her in any way other than the coincidence of a common surname printed on a case label in a car she'd stumbled into while running from 3 men on a Tuesday night. She told herself this firmly, the way she told herself every other hopeful thing, carefully, with adequate distance, not too much weight given to it before it was confirmed. But her hands were not steady when she typed the next search. Robert James Cole, Nashville, Tennessee. The results were thinner. A few legal filings in the county records database, accessible only in summary format without the full documents. A 1981 mention in a business brief about a contested freight route. A gap of several years. Then, in 1988, a series of brief articles that appeared in quick succession, each one reporting the same developing story from different angles. Hartwell Rail faces insolvency proceedings. Federal bankruptcy court appoints receiver for Hartwell and Southern. Hartwell Rail Yard acquisition completed by Voss Meridian Holdings. She read the articles twice, then a third time, extracting the sequence of events from the compressed language of business reporting. In 1986, Hartwell and Southern had taken out a series of loans to fund yard modernization, new equipment, track upgrades, infrastructure investment intended to keep the yard competitive as national freight patterns shifted. The loans had come from a financial entity called Meridian Capital Partners. By 1987, the company was in arrears on the loans. By late 1987, Meridian Capital had petitioned the federal bankruptcy court for receivership. By 1988, a related company, Voss Meridian Holdings, run by a developer named Harlan Voss, had acquired the yard's assets and land title through the receivership process. She sat back and looked at the screen. She had worked in enough diners, processed enough conversations she was not meant to overhear between the kind of men who ate expensive lunches and talked about business with the confidence of people who had never been on the wrong side of a business transaction, to understand the shape of what she was reading. Meridian Capital had lent the money. Meridian Capital had called the loan. Voss Meridian Holdings related, same man, different entity, had bought the asset from the receivership it had itself triggered. The land had transferred from the Cole family to Harlan Voss for cents on the dollar in a process that was technically legal and practically designed from the beginning to end that way. Robert Cole had filed an objection to the receivership in 1987. She found the filing reference in the court record summary. The objection had been dismissed. She found no subsequent filings. No appeal. The record simply stopped. She thought about what it meant when a man's legal filings simply stopped. She spent another hour in the library, tracking the subsequent history of the Hartwell Rail Yard land under Voss Meridian and its successor entities. Harlan Voss had not developed the yard immediately. He had held the land through a series of company restructurings, possibly for tax reasons, possibly for strategic ones. By the early 2000s, the entity holding the land was called Voss Development Group, and its portfolio included not just the rail yard, but a substantial concentration of industrial and near-downtown properties across Nashville and 3 surrounding counties. By the time Nashville's property market began its dramatic acceleration in the 2010s, Harlan Voss owned approximately 200 acres of land in and around the city, much of it purchased in the same manner as the rail yard through financial pressure, receivership, and related entity acquisition. He was, by current estimates, she found in a 2021 Nashville Business Journal profile, worth somewhere north of $800 million. She left the library at 4 in the afternoon and walked back to the shelter in the pale October light. And she thought about a man named James Earl Cole who had built something from a First World War veteran's determination and 5 decades of work, and a man named Robert Cole who had filed an objection that had been dismissed, and a woman named Lisa Cole who had died on a kitchen floor when her daughter was 6 years old, and a daughter named Nadia who had been handed $40 in a photocopied list of phone numbers on her 18th birthday and told, in effect, that the story ended there. The story had not ended there. She was going back to the rail yard. She gave herself a week to prepare. The decision was not impatience delayed, it was the careful patience of someone who understood that doing this right mattered more than doing it quickly. She needed tools. She needed a plan. She needed to understand the maintenance schedule precisely enough that she could work in the car without being interrupted. The maintenance log photographs, which she had enlarged on the library terminal and studied carefully, showed check-ins on dates that clustered in the middle of the month. The last check had been the 14th. If the pattern held, the next would be somewhere around the 18th to 25th of November, more than 4 weeks away. She had time. She bought a pry bar at the hardware surplus on Clarkson, secondhand, for $. A flashlight with 4 fresh batteries, $6 at the dollar store on 5th. A small combination lockpick set, the kind sold legally as a hobby tool, marketed to locksport enthusiasts from an online reseller via a library computer and a convenience store money order, delivered to the shelter's package address with Mrs. Donahue, the intake manager's permission, and a brief, partially true explanation that she was taking a locksmithing course. $11. A cloth bag to carry everything. $2 at the church resale shop on Maynard. $23 total. She had not touched her savings. She returned to the Hartwell Rail Yard on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of October, entering through the same flattened fence section, moving through the same rows of dead freight cars in the same darkness. She had the flashlight, and she had the tools, and she had the photographs on her phone, and she had the particular focused calm that came from being very afraid of the right things for the right reasons. The boxcar was exactly as she'd left it. The hatch frame's bent section was still in position. The modern lock on the main door glinted faintly in the flashlight beam, disguised and unchanged. She climbed through the hatch and dropped down into the car's interior with the practiced ease of someone doing something for the second time. The cases on the shelves were undisturbed. Case 007 was exactly where she'd last seen it, its label clear in the flashlight beam. Cole family documentation and legal. She sat down cross-legged in front of it and opened the lockpick set. She had watched 37 minutes of instructional video at the library terminal across 2 sessions, studying 3-dial combination locks specifically. The technique was tactile. You applied light rotational pressure to the shackle while turning each dial slowly, feeling for the slight resistance that indicated a correct digit. It required patience and a steady hand, and a willingness to work through failure without losing focus. It took her 41 minutes. The first dial was a 6. The second was a 9. The third was a 2. She felt each one give in turn, subtle and certain. And when the third dial released and the shackle lifted free, she sat for a moment with her palm flat on the case lid before she opened it. She opened it. Inside, arranged in careful order, were documents. Not loose paper's archival sleeves, the kind used in libraries and records offices to preserve paper against time and humidity, each one sealed and labeled in handwriting she did not recognize. She lifted the first sleeve and held it to the flashlight beam. The document inside was a deed. She could see through the archival plastic clearly enough to read the essential lines. A property deed for 43 acres in Davidson County, Tennessee, dated 1923, conveying the land to James Earl Cole of Nashville for consideration of $1,200, signed by the county registrar, witnessed, sealed. The original deed to the Hartwell Rail Yard. The document that said this land had belonged to one man, and through him to his family, before it was taken. She set it down and reached for the next sleeve. A corporate charter for Hartwell and Southern Rail, dated 1923, naming James Earl Cole as sole proprietor. Operating records from 1924 through 1931, bound together, showing the yard's growth from a 2-track operation to a facility with 12 operational tracks and a workforce of 40. Financial records from the yard's peak years in the 1950s and 1960s. Each year's books carefully balanced and clearly profitable. Tax filings. Payroll records. The documented evidence of a business built carefully and maintained well over 5 decades. Then a different kind of document. A letter, handwritten on paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea, dated September 14, 1987, addressed in the careful formal script of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taken seriously. To whom it may concern, and specifically to any descendant of this family who comes to read these words, my name is Robert James Cole. My father was James Earl Cole, who built this yard with his own hands beginning in 1923. I am writing this in the knowledge that I may not be able to stop what is being done to our family's property, but that the truth of what has been done must be preserved for whoever comes after me. In 1986, I was approached by a man named Harlan Voss, who presented himself as an investor interested in modernizing the yard's operations. He connected me with his financing entity, Meridian Capital Partners, who offered terms I believed were reasonable and necessary to keep the yard competitive. I was wrong to trust him. I understand now that the loan terms were designed to be unserviceable, the interest structured to compound faster than any freight operation could generate the revenue to cover it. When default was triggered in 1987, the receivership petition was already prepared. The judge assigned to the case had prior financial connections to Voss, which were not disclosed. The process moved faster than any legitimate insolvency proceeding I have ever seen documented. I have filed an objection. I do not expect it to be successful. The men involved have resources I cannot match. What I can do is document the truth. In this case, and in the others stored alongside it, I have preserved the full record of my father's legitimate ownership, the fraudulent structure of the loan agreement, the connections between Voss and Meridian Capital, and the evidence of the judge's undisclosed conflict of interest. I have also preserved something else. Something my father built into this car in 1963 and showed me when I was 19 years old, telling me it was the family's real security, separate from the yard's operational accounts, held in a form that could not be seized by creditors because it would not appear on any balance sheet. If this yard is taken from us, and I believe it will be, the asset my father secured must not transfer with it. It must wait for a Cole to come back and claim it. I do not know who will read this or when. I have one grandchild, a girl named Lisa, my son Marcus's daughter, who is 12 years old and does not yet understand what is happening. If things go wrong, and I believe they will, she must be found. She must be told. The truth belongs to the family it was taken from. Robert James Cole, September 1987. Nadia read the letter twice. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked at the ceiling of the sealed freight car and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because her throat had closed around something too large and too complicated and too long overdue to come out as words. Lisa, her mother's name. Robert Cole's granddaughter, 12 years old in 1987, which would have made her born in 1975, which was the year on the back of the only photograph Nadia had of her. Marcus Cole, a grandfather's name, a family name that was her name, a family she had been told did not exist. She sat in the dark for a long time. The letter had said something her father built into this car in 1963. She looked at the partition, the hidden panel, the pressure release catch, the gap of sealed cold air that had breathed across her fingers on her first visit. Her great-great-grandfather had built something into this car 60 years ago, and Robert Cole had preserved the documentation of it. And now she was sitting here alone at 20 years old with a flashlight and a secondhand pry bar and the accumulated facts of a story that had been running parallel to her entire life. Without her knowledge, she kept reading. There were more documents in the case. A copy of the loan agreement with Meridian Capital, annotated in Robert Cole's hand, margin notes identifying the specific clauses that had been designed to fail. A document that appeared to be a private investigator's report, dated 1987, detailing the financial relationship between Harlan Voss and the bankruptcy court judge. A letter from a Nashville attorney named Patricia Webb, dated October 1987, informing Robert Cole that his objection had been dismissed and that appeals would require a retainer she named that was several times what Nadia currently had in savings. A letter from Robert Cole to Patricia Webb, declining not because he had given up, but because he had chosen a different approach. I will not spend what remains fighting a court that has already been bought. I will preserve the evidence and protect the asset. Someday, someone with less to lose and more to gain will be able to use this. And at the very bottom of the case, sealed in its own archival sleeve, a letter addressed in different handwriting, slightly shaky, slightly rushed, as though written by someone working against time or strength. On the outside of the sleeve, in the same handwriting, for Nadia, if she is ever found. She stopped breathing. She held the sleeve in both hands and looked at it in the flashlight beam. The handwriting. She knew that handwriting. She had one photograph and one name. But she had also, in the intake file from her first foster placement, a photocopied letter that had been placed in her file by the social worker who processed her entry into the system, a letter from a neighbor of Lisa Cole's who had written to explain the circumstances of the woman's death to whoever would be responsible for her child. She had read that letter once, at age 14, in a caseworker's office while the caseworker stepped out to take a phone call, and she had memorized the handwriting of the neighbor's name at the bottom with the obsessive attention of a child looking for any detail that connected her to something real. This was not that handwriting. This handwriting, slightly shaky, slightly rushed, was her mother's. She knew it the way you knew something you had no rational reason to know. The way you knew a smell that preceded a specific memory. The way you knew a voice you had not heard in 14 years, but which had been the first voice you ever heard. She carefully opened the sleeve. The letter inside was dated February 2002. Her mother would have been 27. Nadia would have been, she calculated, 1 year old. My darling girl, you will not understand this letter for many years, and by then I may not be here to explain it. I am writing it because I have been sick, and while I believe I will get better, I have learned that believing things does not always make them true. And because there are things you must know that no one else will tell you. Your great-grandfather James built something in the Hartwell Rail Yard before I was born. Your grandfather Robert told me about it when I was 18, just before he died. He told me the yard had been stolen, and that what James had hidden inside it was worth more than I could understand, and that someday, if I was careful and patient and brave, I could go back and claim it. He told me the key to finding it was in case 007, in the car at the end of the 4th row, in the yard my family built. I have not been brave enough yet. I have been afraid. The man who took the yard, Harlan Voss, is still powerful, and I have been raising you alone, and there are things a young mother with a baby is willing to risk and things she is not. But I am telling you this now, so that if something happens to me before I am brave enough, you will know. You will know you are not nobody. You are not a girl with no history. You are the great-great-granddaughter of James Earl Cole, who came home from a world war and built something with his own hands in this city because he believed that what you build yourself cannot be taken from you. He was wrong about that, but he was right about everything else. Go to the yard, my love. Go to the car. Find what he left for us. It is yours. It has always been yours. I love you more than this letter can hold. Mom. Nadia folded the letter along its original crease with hands that were not steady and placed it back in its sleeve with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable, which it was. She set the sleeve down on top of the other documents. She turned off the flashlight and sat in the complete darkness of the sealed car, and she cried not quietly and not briefly, but with the full, shaking weight of 20 years of being told that she came from nothing, that there was nothing to find, that the story of her family began and ended with a kitchen floor in an apartment on Gresham Avenue in the fall of 2009. Her mother had known. Her mother had known and had been afraid and had gotten sick before she could be brave enough. And the letter had never reached Nadia because there was no mechanism for it to reach her. It had been sealed in a case in a locked car in an abandoned yard waiting for a girl who aged out of foster care with $40 and a photocopied list of phone numbers and no idea that her great-great-grandfather had built a freight yard that had been stolen from her family before she was born. She cried until she stopped. Then she turned the flashlight back on. She had work to do. She returned the documents to case 007 and latched it closed. She would need to come back with copies with a way to preserve this information outside the car before she attempted anything further. But first she needed to understand what her mother's letter had pointed toward. What James Cole had hidden in 1963. What was behind the partition? She went to the hidden panel. She found the pressure point on the third attempt, the upper right corner, press and pull, and felt the catch release and the panel shift inward. This time, she let it open fully. The gap revealed was narrow, perhaps 18 inches wide, but what she could see beyond it with the flashlight beam showed her enough to understand the scale of what she was looking at. Behind the partition, running the full width and height of the rear third of the car, were shelves. Different from the document shelves, heavier, more structural, built to bear weight rather than simply to hold cases. And on those shelves, arranged with the same deliberate care as everything else in this car, were containers. Not crates, not boxes, proper metal containers, sealed, each one approximately the size of a large suitcase, stacked 3 high in 2 columns on each side, with a narrow aisle between the columns. She counted 8 containers visible from the gap. The aisle extended deeper than her flashlight reached. She squeezed through the gap. The rear section of the car was larger than it had appeared from outside the partition. The false wall had been built further back than the exterior proportions suggested, adding perhaps 4 feet of concealed depth she had not accounted for. In the full reach of the flashlight, she counted 16 containers in total. Each one bore a combination of serial numbers and single-letter codes she didn't immediately understand. Each one was sealed with a locking mechanism similar in style to the cases in the front section, 3-dial combination locks, the same manufacturer, the same era of construction. The containers rested on a floor that was different from the rest of the car's interior. Not the original steel floorboards, hardwood, laid in panels that were tight-fitted and sealed at the edges. A false floor. She knelt and pressed both palms flat against it, feeling through the wood for what was beneath it. Dense, heavy, the cold that went deep. She looked up at the ceiling of the rear section. The same modification of false ceiling, lower than the car's natural roof height, leaving a concealed void above. She stood on the bottom shelf level and pressed her hand to the ceiling panels. The same density, the same depth of cold. The car had been modified in 3 dimensions. Not just the partition, the floor, the ceiling, and the walls of the rear section had all been built out to create sealed, insulated voids around the central storage space. Whatever was inside those containers was being maintained at a consistent temperature regardless of the external conditions, in a climate-controlled hidden chamber inside what appeared to be a dead freight car in an abandoned rail yard. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly in the flashlight beam and tried to hold what she was seeing. James Earl Cole, born sometime in the late 1890s, a veteran who came home from a world war and built a freight yard with his hands, had in 1963 constructed this. A hidden chamber inside one of his own cars. Climate-controlled, structurally reinforced, accessed only through a disguised panel and a series of combination locks. He had shown it to Robert Cole when Robert was 19, and Robert had described what it held to Lisa when Lisa was 18, and Lisa had written a letter to a daughter who was 1 year old at the time telling her that what was inside was worth more than she could understand. And Harlan Voss, who had taken the yard and its 43 acres and built an $800 million property empire on the back of it, had apparently not known this car existed, or had not known what it held, or had known and been unable to access it. Hence the quarterly checks, not by Voss himself, Nadia thought, but by someone on his payroll, performing a routine that had probably been set up years ago and continued out of institutional habit without anyone at the top of the chain necessarily thinking about it too carefully. A locked car in an abandoned yard. Nothing taken from it yet. Check the lock. Move on. They had been maintaining the exterior illusion without knowing that the interior was anything other than an old, empty freight car. She tried the combination she had used on case 00769-2 on the nearest container. The first dial gave. The second did not. She tried variations. 693, 694. She worked through the second dial systematically, number by number, applying the same light pressure technique, and on the seventh attempt 697 the second dial gave. The third dial took 12 more minutes. 6974. The container lock released. She lifted the lid. Inside, packed in dense foam inserts cut precisely to shape, were stacks of paper documents in sealed archival bags, and beneath them, resting in a separate lower compartment, objects she had to lift and hold under the flashlight beam to understand. Gold certificates. Not coins, not bars paper instruments, each one certifying ownership of a specific quantity of gold held in a federal depository, each one bearing the seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. The printing was old 1950s and 1960s era, but the certificates were in extraordinary condition, the archival containment having protected them from the humidity and temperature fluctuations that would have degraded them otherwise. She turned one over in her hands. The denomination printed on its face made her stop breathing again. $5,000. She looked at the stack in the lower compartment. She counted certificates. There were 31 in this container alone. Some bore the 5,000 denomination. Others, she saw as she leafed through them, bore 10,000. 20,000. One bore a denomination she read 3 times before she accepted it as real. $100,000. A single Treasury gold certificate in the sum of $100,000, issued 1962, made out to bearer. She placed everything carefully back in the container and closed it. She stood in the sealed rear section of the car for a very long time. Her flashlight batteries were strong new, fresh from the dollar store, and the beam held steady on the other 15 containers in their rows, each one locked, each one sealed, each one maintained in the climate-controlled dark of this hidden chamber for 60 years. James Cole had been building something in this car since 1963. Accumulating, storing, preserving. Gold certificates. She understood now instruments that would have been issued in large denominations primarily to corporations and institutional holders. Instruments that were technically not in wide circulation by the time gold certificates were phased out in the 1960s, but which remained legal financial instruments. Redeemable, valid, their value tied not to the paper, but to the underlying precious metal they represented. A man who had built and operated a profitable freight business for 40 years, who had reason to distrust banks, who had watched what happened to families who trusted institutions during the Depression, might very well have converted a portion of his earnings into instruments like these. Durable, bearer format, outside the banking system. Waiting. She tried 3 more containers in the next 2 hours. The second held more gold certificates, these in smaller denominations. But there were more of them. She estimated 60 or 70 before she stopped counting and simply looked at the depth of the stack. The third held something different. Not certificates, bonds. U.S. Treasury bonds and municipal bonds in denominations ranging from $1,000 to $50,000, all dated between 1945 and 1967, all made out to bearer, all sealed in their archival compartments with the same meticulous care. Many of them had matured. She understood enough about bonds to know that matured instruments continued to accrue interest, that the value on the face of the document was not the current value, that 60 years of compounded interest on instruments like these could multiply their face value several times over. The fourth container stopped her entirely. It held, in addition to financial instruments she had not yet cataloged, a document she recognized from the photographs she had taken of Robert Cole's materials in case 007. A comprehensive legal analysis, prepared by an attorney. She did not recognize the firm name on the letterhead was Daly and Associates, Nashville, dated 1989, 2 years after the fraudulent receivership, detailing the full scope of the fraud perpetrated by Harlan Voss and Meridian Capital Partners against the Cole family. It named the judge. It named the financial connections. It identified the structural mechanisms of the scheme, and it included, in a section near the end, a valuation, not of the financial instruments in the car, of the land. 43 acres in Davidson County, Tennessee, acquired by fraudulent receivership in 1988, current estimated value, and here the attorney had written the 1989 figure, which was the land's value before Nashville's subsequent decades of development, $3.2 million. The current value of that land, she had seen in the 2021 Business Journal profile of Harlan Voss, was estimated at somewhere between $45 and $60 million. The land alone, based on the fraudulent transfer, represented a claim that dwarfed the financial instruments she had been cataloging. And the financial instruments in this car, if the 4 containers she had opened were representative of the remaining 12, if the denominations and quantities she had seen held across the full set, she could not calculate it with the precision the number deserved. But she could feel the scale of it the way you felt cold through a thin jacket. Pervasive, impossible to ignore, larger than anything she had words for yet. She had come into this yard running from 3 men who wanted $62. She was standing in the middle of something that dwarfed every number she had ever had reason to think about in her own life. She had to be careful now, more careful than she had been with anything. She closed and locked the 4th container, squeezed back through the partition gap, closed the hidden panel until she felt it catch, sat on the floor of the front section in the flashlight beam, and made herself think clearly about what came next. She could not handle this alone. This was the first and most important thing to accept, not because she lacked intelligence or courage, but because the legal dimensions of what she had found, the fraud claim, the property claim, the financial instruments and their authentication and their redemption required expertise she did not have and could not acquire fast enough to act before the situation changed. The maintenance schedule gave her time, but not unlimited time. The next check-in was perhaps 4 weeks away. After that, another 6 to 8 weeks. But schedules changed. Circumstances changed. She needed to move with purpose, not with panic, but she needed to move. She needed a lawyer. The thought arrived with an absurdity she could not quite shake. She was 20 years old. She slept in a shelter. She had $847 in savings. And she needed a lawyer who would take seriously a story about a sealed freight car in an abandoned rail yard and a fraudulent 1987 bankruptcy and 60 years of accumulated financial instruments and a land claim against one of Nashville's wealthiest developers. On the basis of her word, before she had copied a single document, before she had authenticated a single certificate, before she had anything in hand except photographs on a cracked pay-as-you-go phone. She thought about how this looked from the outside. She thought about the way people had looked at her across her entire life at intake desks, at hiring windows, in the housing assistance office, in the diner where she carried their food, and they looked through her rather than at her. She knew what the world did with stories like hers when they came out of mouths like hers. She knew what happened when a homeless 20-year-old black woman walked into a law office and said she had a claim worth hundreds of millions of dollars against a prominent developer. She also knew that none of that changed the facts. The facts were in Case 007. The facts were in 16 sealed containers in a climate-controlled hidden chamber. The facts were in Robert Cole's letter and her mother's letter and a deed dated 1923 and a gold certificate she had held in her own hands with her own name on the family it had been taken from. The facts did not care about optics. They cared about evidence. And she had evidence. She needed one person who would listen before dismissing. One person with legal knowledge and a willingness to sit with an improbable story long enough to let the evidence speak. She had learned, across 20 years of navigating institutions that were designed not to see her, that there was always one person. Not always in the expected place, not always at the expected moment, but always one. She turned off the flashlight to save the battery. She sat in the sealed dark of the car, and she made a list in her head. Every person she had encountered in her 20 years who had treated her as someone worth listening to. Mr. Henderson, who was in a different city and a different life now. Mr. Osei at the library branch, who was kind but was a librarian, not a lawyer. Mrs. Donahue at the Deacon Street shelter, who had let her use the package address, and who had that particular quality of competent, unsentimental care that suggested she had connections to the social services infrastructure in ways that went deeper than her job title. Mrs. Donahue had once mentioned, during a conversation about housing assistance applications, that she sat on the board of a legal aid organization. Nadia sat in the dark and held that thought. Legal aid served people who couldn't afford legal representation. That was her. But legal aid organizations also, typically, handled cases based on merit and resource capacity rather than the ability to pay. A case with this kind of evidence, this kind of scale, against this kind of opponent, that was a case that might interest someone beyond the typical scope of a legal aid office. That might interest someone who worked at legal aid because they believed in something, and who would recognize what they were being shown when they saw it. She needed to go back to Mrs. Donahue. She needed to copy the documents in case 007 first. She needed to do all of this without telling anyone what she had until she had the right person in the room. She climbed back through the hatch, pressed the frame back into position, dropped to the ground. The rail yard was quiet around her. Cold and still, the way it always was, the way it had been for 35 years while the world moved on outside its fences, and 43 acres of a stolen legacy sat in the dark and waited for someone to come back. She had come back. She stood in the cold for a moment, looking at the car. It looked like everything else in this yard dead, abandoned, finished. The disguise was good. It had held for decades, through 2 bankruptcies and 3 ownership changes, and a city that had reinvented itself twice around these 43 forgotten acres. But she had her great-great-grandfather's hands for a moment when she held that deed, the weight of a document he had signed with a pen he had held, in a county office he had walked into, to claim something he had built. She had her mother's voice in the slightly shaky handwriting of a letter written to a 1-year-old child who might not be found for years. They had been waiting, all of them, for someone to come back to the yard. She was back. She turned and walked through the dark toward the fence. Mrs. Donahue was at the intake desk when Nadia came in from the late shift, and she looked up with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 20 years reading people accurately at first glance and had learned to distinguish ordinary tired from a different kind of tired entirely. Nadia sat down across the desk without being asked. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it on the walk back from the rail yard, standing in the diner bathroom before her shift, lying awake on her shelter bunk in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the room's ambient sounds, the breathing of 8 other women, the distant traffic, the building's steam heat knocking in the pipes, formed a kind of white noise as she had learned to think inside. She had reduced it to its essential form. Stripped of the emotional weight she could not afford to lead with if she wanted to be taken seriously. Mrs. Donahue, I need to talk to you about something. I need you to listen to the whole thing before you respond, because I understand how it sounds, and I need you to hear the evidence before you decide what to do with what I'm telling you. Mrs. Donahue set down her pen. She listened for 45 minutes. She did not interrupt. She did not shift in her chair with the restlessness of someone waiting for the story to end so they could render their judgment. She listened the way people listened when they already understood that the shape of a story mattered as much as its content, when they had enough experience with injustice to recognize its architecture even in a form they hadn't seen before. When Nadia finished, Mrs. Donahue sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Nadia. You have photographs of the documents. You have photographs of the containers and the cases. You have the maintenance log, all on my phone, and backed up to an email account. Mrs. Donahue was quiet for another moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a business card and set it on the desk between them. Her name is Eleanor Marsh. She runs the Property Rights Division at the Tennessee Civil Justice Foundation. She has been working civil fraud cases in this state for 30 years, and she has taken on defendants a lot more powerful than Harlan Voss and one. She will listen to you. Tell her I sent you, and tell her everything you told me. Everything. Nadia looked at the card. Then she looked at Mrs. Donahue. Why are you doing this? It was not quite a question. Mrs. Donahue seemed to understand the distinction. Because you walked in here 2 years ago with $40 and a list of phone numbers, and in 2 years you have worked 3 jobs, saved nearly $1,000, treated every person in this building with more basic dignity than most of them had seen in years, and never once asked me for anything beyond what this shelter is actually here to provide. She paused. And because if half of what you're telling me is true, what happened to your family is exactly the kind of thing Eleanor Marsh has spent her career fighting. She pushed the card forward another inch. Call her in the morning. Not from the shelter line. From the library. Eleanor Marsh's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Commerce Street that smelled of old paper and industrial coffee and the specific mustiness of a place where serious work was done without adequate funding. She was 54, solidly built, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and a way of holding her face in stillness while she listened that Nadia recognized as a professional skill, the same quality she had seen in the best teachers she'd encountered, the ones who made you feel that your words were being genuinely received rather than processed. She looked at the photographs for a long time. She asked questions, precise, specific, non-leading questions about exactly what Nadia had touched, exactly what she had opened, exactly what she had read. She asked about the maintenance log and the frequency of check-ins and the nature of the modern lock on the exterior door. She asked about the combination lock system on the containers and how many Nadia had opened and what she had done with the contents after examining them. She did not ask whether Nadia was sure. She did not ask whether Nadia might have misread the situation. She asked about evidence. When she was done asking questions, she sat back and took her glasses off the chain and put them on and looked at the photographs again, specifically the image of the deed from case 007 and the image of Robert Cole's 1987 letter. Then she said, "How long have you known about this?" 3 weeks. "Who else have you told?" "Mrs. Donahue." "Anyone outside the shelter system?" "No one." Eleanor Marsh nodded slowly, the nod of someone whose mental process had just completed a specific calculation. She took the glasses off again and set them on the desk and looked at Nadia directly. "I'm going to tell you what I see here, and then I'm going to tell you what I think we should do, and I want you to ask me every question you have, because this process will go better if you understand every step of it before we take it." Nadia said, "All right. What you've described is consistent with a pattern of financial fraud I've seen variations of many times in this state, specifically in the period between 1980 and 1995, when federal bankruptcy law created structures that were susceptible to exactly this kind of manipulation. A lender who is also, through related entities, the intended acquirer. A bankruptcy court judge with undisclosed financial connections. A receivership process that moves at a pace inconsistent with genuine insolvency proceedings. Robert Cole saw it clearly in 1987 and documented it, but he had no resources to fight it, and the legal system at the time gave him no effective recourse." She paused. "The financial instruments you've described, gold certificates and treasury bonds in bearer format, stored in sealed climate-controlled conditions, are a known phenomenon from the mid-20th century. Large denomination bearer instruments issued between roughly 1930 and 1965, held outside the banking system by individuals who distrusted institutional finance. There have been a number of significant cases over the past 20 years involving the discovery and authentication of instruments like these. They are legally valid. Their value is calculated based on current gold prices for the certificates and face value plus compounded interest for the bonds. Based on what you're describing, 16 containers, the denominations you observed in the 4 you opened, I cannot give you a number yet. But I can tell you it will be large." Nadia said, "How large?" Eleanor Marsh said, "I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. Authentication will require a forensic financial expert and a certified appraiser. Those processes take time. But based on what you've told me about what you observed in those 4 containers alone," she stopped. She chose her next words carefully. "I have handled cases in this range before. I know what the evidence looks like when it points to something significant. This points to something significant." She put her glasses back on the chain. "The land claim is separate and in some ways more straightforward. 43 acres of Davidson County real estate transferred through a fraudulent receivership in 1988, currently held by Voss Development Group's successor entity. The fraud documented in Robert Cole's materials. If it holds up under legal scrutiny, and based on what you've described, I believe it will create a basis for a civil claim that bypasses the standard statute of limitations because it involves concealment of the fraudulent nature of the transfer. We would argue the clock did not start until the fraud was discovered, which is now." She looked at Nadia steadily. "I want to take this case. I am not going to charge you a retainer because you don't have one, and because this office exists to handle exactly this kind of matter. I am also going to be honest with you that cases of this type, against defendants with the resources Harlan Voss has, are long and hard, and they involve pressure tactics that are designed to make the plaintiff give up. I need to know that you understand that before we begin." Nadia said, "I aged out of foster care with $40 and nowhere to go. I've been managing pressure tactics my whole life." Eleanor Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Good. We start tomorrow." The first step was documentation. Eleanor sent 2 paralegals to the rail yard the following week not to remove anything, but to conduct a supervised inventory of the visible contents with Nadia present, using a professional camera and a written log that would serve as dated evidence of the discovery's condition prior to any formal legal action. They photographed every case on the shelves of the front section, every container in the rear section, the hidden panel mechanism, the maintenance log, the disguised lock on the exterior door. They documented the hatch access point. They photographed the overall condition of the car and its position in the yard. They were inside for 2 hours. The maintenance schedule gave them room. But Eleanor moved with the focused urgency of someone who understood that room was not the same as safety. The same day, she filed a preliminary notice with Davidson County Civil Court, establishing a legal record that the property and its contents were the subject of active litigation before any other party could make a competing claim. It was a procedural move, bloodless and technical, but it mattered enormously. It created a dated legal record that anyone who subsequently tried to remove or alter the contents of the car would be acting in contempt of court. Nadia was at the shelter when Eleanor called that evening. It's filed. Whatever Voss knows or doesn't know, the car and its contents are now under court protection. He can't legally touch them. Nadia sat on the edge of her bunk and held the phone and felt something release in her chest that she had not realized was held. The authentication process began 2 weeks later. A forensic financial specialist named Dr. Kwame Asare, who had worked on 3 previous cases involving mid-century bearer instruments, spent 4 days in the car with Eleanor's team, working through each container methodically, cataloging every instrument with the precision of an archivist and the analytical attention of someone who had spent 30 years understanding what these documents were worth and why. Nadia was not permitted inside during the authentication. Court protocol required that the process be conducted without the claimant present to prevent any argument of chain of custody compromise, but Eleanor called her each evening with updates delivered in the measured tones of someone who had learned to report numbers without performing them. Day 1. The gold certificates across all 16 containers had been fully inventoried. Dr. Asare's preliminary count showed 412 individual certificates in denominations ranging from $1,000 to $100,000, face values summing to approximately $41 million. At current gold prices, accounting for the conversion rate established when gold certificates were formally discontinued, the redemption value of these instruments was substantially higher than face value. Day 2. The Treasury bonds. 193 instruments. Denominations from $500 to $50,000, spanning issue dates from 1945 to 1967. Face value approximately $22 million. With compounded interest accrued since maturity. Eleanor paused here, and Nadia heard her breath. The current value was approximately $68 million. Day 3. The municipal bonds, the mixed instruments, and a category Dr. Asare had not initially expected to find. Inside 6 of the containers, beneath the primary layer of financial instruments, was a second layer. Not certificates or bonds. Physical gold. Not bars coins, predominantly U.S. gold eagles from the early 20th century, St. Gaudens double eagles, and a significant quantity of pre-1933 gold coins that had been removed from circulation when private gold ownership was restricted and which had subsequently, when restrictions were lifted in 1974, become extremely valuable as numismatic assets. The coins were individually cataloged. There were over 2,000 of them. Day 4. Dr. Asare completed his preliminary valuation and sent it to Eleanor's office in a sealed document that Eleanor read once, alone, before she called Nadia. Her voice, when she called, was steady. Eleanor Marsh had been a lawyer for 30 years, and she knew how to keep a steady voice. But something underneath it had shifted in a way Nadia could hear even through the phone's small speaker. Dr. Asare's preliminary total, accounting for the gold certificates at current redemption value, the bonds with accrued interest, the municipal instruments, and the numismatic assessment of the gold coin collection, is $218 million. That figure does not include the land claim. It does not include legal damages for the fraudulent transfer. It does not include the punitive elements that will be argued once we formally file against Voss Development. Nadia said nothing. Eleanor continued. The land claim, based on current assessed value of the 43 acres under its current development designation, plus interest on the fraudulent transfer price since 1988, comes to approximately $97 million. Legal damages and punitive claims, we are being conservative in our preliminary estimate, another $55 million. The total figure we will be filing for, Nadia, is $370 million. The number landed in the silence of the shelter dormitory like something dropped from a great height. Nadia was sitting on the same bunk she had been sitting on for 2 years, for months, and 29 days. The same thin mattress. The same cracked floor tiles visible in the gap between her bunk and the next one. The same ambient sounds of other lives being lived in the same constrained space. She was wearing the same jeans she wore on the Tuesday she had run into the rail yard, repaired now at the knee where they had caught on the fence. She had, as of her last check, $913 in her savings account. She said, $370 million. Eleanor said, that is the figure. Another silence. Nadia said, my great-great-grandfather built a freight yard in 1923. Eleanor's voice, when she answered, was no longer the measured delivery of a lawyer presenting findings. It was something else, something quieter. He did, and he protected what he built the only way he knew how. And so did Robert Cole, and so did your mother in the only way she could. And now we are going to make sure a court of law acknowledges what was done to this family. She paused. Are you all right? Nadia looked at the ceiling of the shelter dormitory. She thought about a kitchen floor in an apartment on Gresham Avenue. She thought about $40 and a photocopied list of phone numbers. She thought about a woman who had been afraid, who had written a letter to a 1-year-old child and sealed it in a steel case in the dark, hoping that the child would someday be found. She said, I will be. The formal filing happened on a Thursday morning in the Davidson County Circuit Court. Eleanor and her team had spent 3 weeks preparing the complaint, a document of 114 pages that laid out the full history of the fraud, the evidence from Robert Cole's documentation, Dr. Asare's authentication findings, the land claim analysis, and the legal theory connecting all of it to a present-day claim by the sole surviving heir of the Cole family. It named Harlan Voss personally and Voss Development Group as the primary defendants. It named 2 deceased associates as co-conspirators whose estates bore partial liability. It named the estate of the bankruptcy court judge whose undisclosed financial relationship with Voss had corrupted the 1987 proceedings. Eleanor had also, in the 2 days before filing, made 3 calls to a reporter at the Nashville Banner, to a legal affairs correspondent at a regional wire service, and to a civil rights organization in Memphis that had been tracking property theft cases across Tennessee for a decade. She had shared only what was in the public filing, which became public record at the moment of filing. By the afternoon of that Thursday, the story was moving. Nadia was at the diner when her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, and then another, and then Eleanor's number, and she stepped outside into the alley behind the kitchen and answered Eleanor's call. It's out. Are you somewhere safe? I'm at work. Good. Stay there until your shift ends. I have a car coming for you afterward. You're not going back to the shelter tonight. I've arranged a different place for you to stay while this is active. Do you understand why? Nadia understood why. She said Voss. He filed a response within 3 hours of our complaint. That's not a legal timeline. That's a prepared team waiting for us to move. He knew, or suspected, that something was coming. Eleanor's voice was composed but precise. His attorneys have already filed a motion to dismiss on multiple grounds. They will also, I expect, attempt to characterize you in ways that are designed to undermine your credibility with the court and with the public. I want you prepared for that. What will they say? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. They will say you are a homeless woman who broke into private property, tampered with assets that belonged to their client's estate, and fabricated a claim based on documents you may have placed yourself. They will try to make this about who you are rather than what the evidence shows. Nadia leaned against the alley wall. The kitchen sounds came through the door behind her, the clatter of plates, a cook calling an order, the specific rhythm of a place that ran on repetition. She had been part of that rhythm for 2 years. She knew it the way you knew things you relied on. She said, they're going to say I made it up. They're going to try. That is what powerful people do when they are cornered by the truth. They attack the person carrying it. Eleanor's voice was level and direct and entirely without reassurance for its own sake. But the evidence is not something they can make disappear. The deed is real. The fraud documentation is real. The authentication is real. $370 million of financial instruments, held in a climate-controlled sealed chamber inside a freight car in a yard that has been under court protection since before Voss's attorneys even knew we were moving. That is not something they can credibly claim you fabricated. We are going to hold the line. You are going to hold the line. Nadia said, I know how to hold a line. She finished her shift. She carried plates and filled coffee and smiled at customers who did not know that the girl carrying their food had, that morning, become the subject of a legal filing that was running on the wire services and would be in the morning papers. She did not cry. She did not perform. She held the ordinary rhythm of the work she had been doing for 2 years, because the ordinary rhythm of work was one of the things that had kept her upright, and she was not finished needing it yet. The car came at 10:30. Eleanor had arranged a room at a residential inn on the west side, the kind of place that did weekly rates for professionals working extended contracts, anonymous and clean, with a deadbolt and a chain and a window that faced the parking lot. Nadia sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room's ceiling and felt the particular vertigo of a situation that was moving faster than her ability to fully absorb it. She took her phone out and looked at the photograph she kept in her camera roll. Her mother at 23, laughing at someone outside the frame. She looked at the joy in that face and tried to map it against everything she now knew. A woman who had grown up knowing her family's land had been stolen, who had carried that knowledge and that fear through a short life that had ended too early on a kitchen floor in an apartment she shouldn't have been living in because she should have had her inheritance and her safety, and her daughter should have grown up in a house with a yard that belonged to them. The anger came later that night, and it was clean, not hot. Not the kind that made you do things you regretted. The kind that organized itself into purpose, that gave shape to the line you were willing to hold indefinitely. Harlan Voss's first move, as Eleanor had predicted, was character. His attorneys issued a statement within 24 hours of the filing that characterized Nadia as a troubled young woman with a history of institutional involvement, whose claim rested on documents of unverifiable provenance discovered during what amounted to criminal trespass on private property. The statement did not use the word homeless directly. It didn't need to. The implication was in every carefully chosen phrase, engineered to activate the specific biases that made people dismiss certain voices before hearing them. The Tennessee Civil Justice Foundation issued a counter-statement that same afternoon, citing Dr. Asare's authentication credentials and the fact that every document in question had been placed under court protection before their existence was publicly disclosed. Eleanor gave one interview, to the Banner, in which she said only what the filing said and let the filing speak. The story was already too large to be managed by implication. The Banner piece ran on page 1. The wire service version was picked up in 12 states by the following morning. The civil rights organization in Memphis put out its own statement, connecting the Cole family case to 3 similar patterns they had documented across Tennessee from the same era. A legal scholar at Vanderbilt gave a quoted assessment to a national outlet that described the Voss fraud scheme as textbook predatory receivership and expressed surprise that it had taken this long for the evidence to surface. Within a week, Harlan Voss's public relations problem had become a legal one. 2 of his development partners issued statements expressing concern. A city council member who had accepted campaign donations from Voss Development announced he was returning them pending the outcome of the case. The Davidson County District Attorney's Office announced it was reviewing the civil filing for potential criminal referral on the fraud and judicial corruption elements. Eleanor called on the 9th day after filing. His attorneys want to discuss settlement terms. Nadia was at the library. She had kept her shelter bed through the transition for the practical reason that she wasn't ready to assume the litigation would resolve quickly, and she went to the library each morning the way she always had. She said, "What terms? We don't know yet. They want a meeting. I recommend we go and listen, but I want you to understand something before we sit across the table from these people." "What?" "You have all the leverage here. The evidence is authenticated. The fraud documentation is ironclad. The judge's undisclosed financial relationship is a matter of record that Voss's attorneys cannot explain away. The criminal referral possibility makes settlement in his interest, not yours. We do not negotiate down. We listen to what they say, and we hold the number, and we let them come to us." Nadia said, $370 million. $370 million. Plus legal fees. Plus a public acknowledgement of the fraud and the theft. Plus that. The meeting was at the offices of Voss's legal team, a firm on Union Street whose conference rooms had views of downtown Nashville that cost money just to look at. Eleanor and her two senior paralegals sat across from four attorneys in the kind of suits that announced their price before you could look away. Nadia sat beside Eleanor and looked at the city through the glass and thought about 43 acres on the southwestern edge of it, and about a man born in the 1890s who had come home from a war and built something with his hands because he believed the things you built yourself could not be taken from you. He had been wrong, but he had not been entirely wrong. Voss's lead attorney opened with a number that was an insult dressed as a negotiation. 22 million, structured over 5 years. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "We'll see you in court." They got up. They walked out. In the elevator going down, one of the paralegals exhaled audibly. Eleanor looked straight ahead. "They will call us before we reach the car." They called before the elevator reached the lobby. The subsequent sessions were less theatrical and more technical. Eleanor's team did not negotiate down. They negotiated the structure of the settlement, how the financial instruments would be transferred, the mechanism for the land claim resolution, the timeline for the punitive component, the wording of the public acknowledgement. They did not move on the total figure. When Voss's attorneys argued that the number was unrealistic, Eleanor produced a line-by-line breakdown prepared by Dr. Asare and a second independent appraiser. When they argued about the land valuation, Eleanor produced the county assessor's current records and a development analysis prepared by a commercial real estate firm that confirmed the 43 acres, under their current designation, were worth every dollar of the claim. The settlement was reached on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks after the filing, in the same conference room with the same downtown view. Nadia signed a document she had read 3 times. Eleanor signed. Voss, who was present for the first time, sat at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one as the most powerful person present and was not accustomed to the inversion. He was 71 years old. His suit was expensive and his posture was the posture of someone who had never fully learned that cost and worth were different things. He looked at Nadia once, across the length of the table, with an expression she didn't try to read because she was not interested in his feelings about the outcome. The total settlement was $370 million, distributed as follows. The financial instruments, returned in full to Nadia as the sole Cole family heir, to be held in a court-administered trust pending final authentication by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve for the gold certificates and bonds. The land claim, resolved through a payment of $97 million to be made within 90 days. Legal damages and punitive component, $55 million. Payable within 120 days. A public statement, issued by Voss Development Group under Harlan Voss's personal signature, acknowledging the fraudulent nature of the 1987 receivership and the theft of Hartwell and Southern Rail from its legitimate owner, James Earl Cole, and his heirs. That statement was the one Nadia had refused to negotiate down on. Eleanor had told her, in the 3rd week of discussions, that Voss's team had offered everything else in full if they could remove the public acknowledgement. Nadia had said no. Eleanor had said no. The acknowledgement was not optional. It ran in the Nashville Banner on a Wednesday morning, alongside a piece that told the full story: James Earl Cole, the yard, the fraud, the sealed car, the letters, the daughter who never knew, and the granddaughter who ran into an abandoned rail yard at midnight while running from 3 men and found $370 million and the truth about where she came from, waiting in the dark for someone to come back. She was sitting in the library when Mr. Osei came to find her. She had kept the habit of coming to the library in the mornings, and she suspected she always would, because the library had been one of the places that had always let her in without asking what she was doing there. He set the newspaper on the table in front of her, opened to the piece, and looked at her with the expression of someone who had known her for 2 years as a young woman who came in to use the computers and had never made the connection to the thing he was now reading. He said, "This is you." She said, "Yes." He looked at the paper for a moment. Then he said, "Your great-great-grandfather built that yard." She said, "He did." Mr. Osei nodded, slowly, the nod of a man processing something that went beyond news into something that felt personal. He said, "The library has records of the yard's founding. We have the original 1923 incorporation documents in the Tennessee Business History Collection. We have a photograph of the groundbreaking ceremony. I never knew the name Cole was connected to. He stopped. He looked at her. Would you like to see them? She said yes. He took her to the archive room, the one that smelled of microfiche and preserved paper, the room she had thought about when she first opened the hatch of the sealed car and caught the smell of what was inside. He found the file and laid the photograph on the reading table under the archival lamp, and she looked at it for a long time. James Earl Cole in 1923, standing in the dirt of a 43-acre lot on the southwestern edge of Nashville, holding a ceremonial shovel, wearing a suit that had been carefully pressed for the occasion. He was young, early 30s, maybe, and lean, with the posture of a man who had survived something difficult and had come through it believing that what came next was worth building. He was looking at the camera with an expression she spent a long time trying to read. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. The expression of a man who understood that what he was standing in was real, was his, had been earned, and that the earning of it mattered as much as the having of it. She took a photograph of the photograph. She put it next to the photograph of her mother on her phone and looked at them side by side. The great-great-grandfather she had never known and the mother she had lost at 6 years old, connected by a line of inheritance that had been interrupted and buried and sealed in the dark and had waited 60 years for someone to find it. The money was real. She understood this more clearly now than she had in the conference room, where the numbers had been too large to carry. $370 million was not a number she could hold in any ordinary way, and she did not try to. She had asked Eleanor, in the days between the settlement and the public acknowledgement, what the practical shape of it looked like, not abstractly, but specifically, what happened next. Eleanor had explained it in terms of structure rather than scale. The financial instruments would be liquidated through the Treasury Department's process over a period of months, converted into liquid assets and held in a trust until the process completed. The land payment and the punitive payment would arrive in 2 tranches within the settlement timeline. Eleanor's fees were a percentage of the settlement, as agreed, substantial in dollar terms, reasonable in percentage terms, and entirely worth it. Tax obligations were significant and required careful planning, which Eleanor had already arranged through a specialist. The net amount Nadia would ultimately control, when everything was processed, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $220 million. What she did with it was, for the first time in her life, entirely her decision. She did not make fast decisions. She had learned, across 20 years of situations where the wrong decision compounded, that the discipline of patience was most important precisely when the pressure to act was highest. She stayed at the residential inn for another 2 weeks after the settlement, attending meetings with Eleanor and the trust administrators, reading documents, asking questions. She did not buy anything. She did not change her routines in any outward way that other people would notice. She went to the diner for her shifts until the day she gave proper notice and left with the particular cleanness of having done something correctly. She went back to the Hartwell Rail Yard on the last day of November, alone, in the early morning before the city was fully awake. The legal process had changed the physical reality of the yard. The car was under an official court seal now, its contents cataloged and in the process of formal transfer. It would look different when she saw it in daylight. She had only ever seen it at night or in a flashlight beam. She walked through the flattened fence section one more time and went down the 4th row of cars to where it sat between the 2 skeleton flat cars, and she stood in front of it in the gray morning light and looked at it. It looked like everything else in the yard. That was the point always. It looked like something the world had finished with. She put her hand flat against the steel side of the car, the way she had on the first night, feeling for the deep cold she had noticed then, the cold that had told her something was different about this one. The cold was there, the same as it had always been, the sealed interior, the preserved chamber, the weight of everything that had been held inside it for 60 years. She stood there with her palm against the steel for a long time. She thought about James Cole standing in the dirt in 1923 with his ceremonial shovel and his expression that was quieter than pride. She thought about Robert Cole in September 1987, writing a letter he knew might not be read for decades, preserving evidence against a theft he could not stop. She thought about her mother at 27, writing a letter to a child who was 1 year old and sealing it in a case, and hoping that the child would someday be found. None of them had given up. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not one of them had accepted the story that was being imposed on them. Not James, who hid what he had built before anyone could take it. Not Robert, who documented the theft even as he was losing. Not Lisa, who wrote a letter in the knowledge that she might not be there to explain it. They had all kept something going, kept something alive, across time they couldn't see the end of, in the faith that someone would eventually come back to claim it. She had come back. She took her hand off the steel. She had made one decision in the weeks since the settlement that she was certain of before she made any others. The Hartwell Rail Yard, all 43 acres, was hers now under the terms of the land claim resolution. The yard was part of the settlement. She owned it. What she did with it was her choice entirely. She was not going to develop it. She was not going to sell it. She was not going to let it become the thing it might easily become if she handed it to the right commercial firm with the right connections, another piece of Nashville's landscape converted to uses that made financial sense in 2024 without any memory of what the land had been or who had stood on it. She was going to restore the yard. Not to Operation Freight Rail was a different world now than the world James Cole had built in, but to meaning. There was a Tennessee state program for historic industrial preservation that Eleanor had mentioned during one of their conversations, a program that worked with private landowners to maintain significant industrial heritage sites as community resources. The Hartwell Yard qualified on multiple criteria. The administrative building with the clock tower was structurally sound. The maintenance shed could be rebuilt. The tracks could be restored to a condition that told the story of what they had been. There was a school on the south side of the city whose students walked past the yard's fence every day without knowing what it was or who had built it. They were going to know. She had asked Eleanor, in the week after the settlement, about the possibility of establishing a foundation, a private foundation, structured to direct resources toward the specific kinds of dispossession that had destroyed her family. Predatory lending, fraudulent receivership, the mechanisms by which property was legally stolen from families who couldn't afford to fight back. Eleanor had said that a foundation was possible, that the structure was well established, and that the question was what Nadia wanted it to do. Nadia had said, "I wanted to do what Robert Cole couldn't. I wanted to fund the fight." They had begun the paperwork the following week. The James Earl Cole Foundation, named for the man who had built something with his hands and believed it could not be taken, and who had been wrong about that, but not about anything else. Its initial endowment would be funded at $20 million. It would partner with legal aid organizations across Tennessee, providing resources for property rights cases that would otherwise be dropped because the claimant couldn't afford to continue. It would hire lawyers. It would hire the kind of investigators Robert Cole had tried to hire in 1987 and couldn't afford. It would fund the fights that evidence won when money was no longer the reason to surrender them. Mrs. Donahue had cried when Nadia told her. Just briefly, in the brisk, unsentimental way of a woman who had decided years ago not to cry at work, but who occasionally found herself overruled by circumstances. Then she had straightened and said, "Miss Rose would be proud." Then she had corrected herself. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud." Nadia had said, "I think they both would." She found a room on Eckhart Street in the first week of December. Not Mrs. Parsons' room that one had been rented to someone else by the time the settlement was finalized, which was exactly as it should be. She found a different room, in a different house, owned by a man named Gerald who was 60 and retired and rented 2 rooms to keep himself company as much as for the income. It was clean and had a window that faced the backyard and a shared kitchen where Gerald made coffee at 6 in the morning and did not require conversation before 7. The rent was $800 a month, which was at the low end of the Nashville market and was exactly what she had been saving toward for 2 years. She paid first and last with a check. She stood in the room on the first evening with her 2 bags of belongings and looked at it. A bed, a dresser, a window, a door with a lock that was hers. She had $913 in the savings account she had been building for 2 years, for months, and 29 days. She had left it there, untouched, through all of it: the settlement, the trust, the foundation endowment, the meetings with attorneys and financial administrators and tax specialists. She had left it there because it was hers in a way that was different from the way the settlement was hers. Every dollar in that account she had earned with her hands and her feet and her patience, 1 double shift and 1 tutoring session and 1 filled coffee cup at a time, in the years when she had no reason to believe that anything was waiting for her except the next 30 days of shelter placement. She left it there because she was not finished needing to know she could do it herself. The Foundation's first grant cycle opened in January. 14 cases across 5 Tennessee counties, each one representing a family that had been told their fight was too expensive to continue. Eleanor sat on the grants committee alongside 2 attorneys who had been working property rights cases for their entire careers and a community organizer from Memphis whose family had lost land in a pattern similar to the Cole case. They awarded 11 of the 14 applications in the first cycle. The 12th and 13th were funded in the second. The 14th was a case involving a 68-year-old woman in Shelby County whose family had owned a 20-acre plot since 1901 and who had lost it in a 1994 tax sale that bore the fingerprints of the same mechanisms Robert Cole had documented in 1987. Eleanor called Nadia when they approved the grant. She said, "It's the same pattern. Different names, different decade." Nadia said, "Fund it." On the last day of February, on a Saturday morning when Nashville was cold and bright, and the sky was the clear blue that appeared in the gaps between winter weather systems, Nadia went to the Hartwell Rail Yard one final time before the restoration project began its formal work. The yard was being assessed by the preservation team that week, surveyors and structural engineers, and a historian from the Tennessee State Library who specialized in industrial heritage. They would be here Monday. Today the yard was still what it had always been, still and silent, and full of everything the city had decided to leave behind. She walked the full perimeter of the 43 acres. She had never done that. She had come in through the flattened fence section every time and gone straight to the car. Now she walked the chain-link boundary from corner to corner, counting her steps, feeling the ground under her feet, looking at the structures that would be rebuilt and the tracks that would be restored and the administrative building at the far end with its clock tower that had been missing its hands for 35 years. She had ordered new hands for the clock. They were being manufactured to the original specifications by a company in Kentucky that specialized in architectural restoration work. They would be installed in the spring. She stopped at the administrative building and looked up at the tower. The clock face was there, weathered but intact, its Roman numerals visible even from this distance. The hands would go back on, and the clock would work again, and people driving past the yard would be able to tell the time from it. The way people had once told the time from it when the yard was running 3 shifts and 214 people passed through its gates. She thought about what it meant to restore something that had been stopped, not to pretend it had never been stopped, not to paper over the 35 years of stillness and the reasons for it, but to start it again, knowing the full history of how it had been interrupted and choosing to let it move forward anyway. That felt like the right word for what was happening. Not recovery, which implied returning to a previous state. Not healing, which implied the wound closing over and becoming invisible. Something more honest than either. A restoration that included the history of the damage as part of what it was restoring. Her mother had been afraid. She had written that herself, in the letter to a 1-year-old daughter, "I have been afraid." Nadia did not hold that against her. She had spent 20 years learning what fear felt like when it was not abstract, when it was the specific fear of someone who had something to lose and no institutional protection and a powerful man somewhere in the background of everything they had tried to build. Fear like that was not weakness. It was information. The question was what you did with it. Her mother had done something with it. She had written the letter. She had sealed it in the case. She had pointed the way. She had done the thing available to her with the resources she had, and she had trusted that it would be enough. It had been enough. Nadia stood at the base of the clock tower in the cold February morning and looked up at the face that would have hands again in the spring, and she understood, in a way that was not dramatic but was complete, what the inheritance actually was. Not the $370 million, though that was real and it mattered, and it was going to fund fights that needed to be funded. Not the 43 acres, or the gold certificates, or the treasury bonds, or the deed dated 1923. Not even the letters, not Robert Cole's careful documentation or her mother's shaky, loving handwriting on the page addressed to a daughter she was afraid might never find her way back. The inheritance was the refusal to give up. That was what had been passed down, through a chain of people she had never met or barely remembered, each one holding onto the next piece of the truth in the only way available to them, in the faith that someone would come after them who would know what to do with it. James had built it. Robert had documented it. Lisa had pointed the way. Each one had done the thing they could do and trusted it forward. She had been the one to come back. She had not come back because she was exceptional. She had come back because she had run into a yard at midnight trying to get away from three men who wanted $62, and she had pressed her palm against the side of a freight car, and she had been the kind of person who noticed when something was colder than it should be, and she had not walked away from the thing that didn't fit. She had been paying attention. That was what the Hendersons had given her. She thought not the 3 years of warmth and chess games and Sunday dinners that had spent down slowly in the placements that followed, but something underneath all of that. The habit of attention. The understanding that the world contained more than it showed you at first glance, and that the difference between what you could see and what was actually there was almost always worth investigating. She took the photograph of James Cole out of her phone and looked at it one more time. The young man in the carefully pressed suit, standing in the dirt of 43 acres he had paid for with $1,200 and intended to build something on. He was looking at the camera with that expression she had spent weeks trying to read and had finally, standing in this yard on this February morning, understood. He was not proud. He was not triumphant. He was not making a statement to anyone watching. He was simply present. Present in the moment of having done the thing, standing on the ground that was his, holding the shovel that had broken the earth, certain only of the next step rather than the whole shape of what he was building. She put the phone in her pocket. The clock tower was missing its hands. The fence was rusted at every joint. The maintenance shed's collapsed roof let the sky in. The tracks ran through dead weeds to nowhere in particular, and the freight cars that had not moved in 35 years sat on those tracks in their patient, rust-colored silence. It was hers. All of it, the broken parts and the intact ones and the history of the damage and the possibility of what came next. It was hers by inheritance, by evidence, by the determination of people she had come from who had refused to let the truth be buried entirely, and by her own refusal to walk away from a freight car that was colder than it should have been on an October night when she had $62 in her pocket and nowhere to go. She turned and walked back through the yard, through the familiar fourth row, past the boxcar that had held everything, and was now, finally, in the process of giving it back. Through the bent fence section, out onto the street, into the ordinary February morning. The clock would have its hands back in the spring. The yard would open to the public in the fall, telling the story of what had been built here and what had been stolen and what had been recovered, for anyone who came to learn it. The foundation would fund its second grant cycle in April, and its third in July, and it would keep going, being the specific inheritance, the thing that outlasted everything else, the thing you passed forward when you didn't know who was coming after you, or when, or what they would need, but you trusted that someone was coming and that what you left them would be enough. It had been enough. It would keep being enough. She walked home through the cold morning to the room on Eckhart Street, with its window that faced the backyard and its door with a lock that was hers, and she made coffee in the kitchen while Gerald sat at the table doing his crossword, and she looked out the window at the narrow strip of frozen ground behind the house, where something might grow in the spring if someone planted it, and she thought about what she was going to plant. Spring came slowly to Nashville that year, the way it always did, not in a single arrival, but in a series of tentative advances. Warm days followed by cold snaps that pulled the temperature back down and made the new leaves on the trees look briefly uncertain about their decision to appear. By the middle of March, the forsythia along the fence lines had gone fully yellow, and by the end of it, the Bradford pears on Commerce Street were in full white bloom, and Nadia walked through all of it with the specific attention of someone noticing a season for the first time, which in one sense she was. She had always been practical about beauty. When you were managing a deficit, the things that cost nothing and gave nothing back in material terms got filed away as secondary. She had registered seasons the way you registered background music, present, occasionally pleasant, not the thing you were focusing on. That spring she looked at everything. The clock hands arrived on a Tuesday in April, packed in custom foam inside a wooden crate that two men carried carefully from a flatbed truck into the administrative building at the Hartwell Rail Yard, while the preservation team's project manager, a woman named Simone who wore steel-toed boots and a hard hat she pushed up on her forehead when she wasn't actively in a hazard zone, supervised the unloading with the focused attention of someone who understood that irreplaceable things required irreplaceable care. They were black iron, matching the original specifications that Simone's team had found in a 1924 engineering drawing preserved in the Tennessee State Library's Industrial History Collection. The minute hand was 4 feet long. The hour hand was 3. Each one had been fabricated by a craftsman in Kentucky who worked from the drawing with the same precision he would have brought to a structural element, because that was what clock hands on a tower were: structural, functional, part of the architecture of a place's relationship to time. The installation took most of a Wednesday. A crane brought in for the purpose. 2 workers in harnesses. Simone on the ground with a radio and a level of concentration that suggested she had done this before in circumstances where getting it wrong had real consequences. Nadia stood at the base of the tower and watched. When the minute hand was seated and the hour hand was seated and the mechanism inside the tower was engaged and the clock face above them showed a time that was, for the first time in 35 years, the actual time, Simone lowered her hard hat and looked at Nadia and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your great-great-grandfather installed the original movement in 1931. It ran for 53 years without a major failure." Nadia looked up at the clock face. She said, "What time did it stop?" Simone checked her notes. The last documented maintenance record was from 1984. The hands were removed in 1987. Prior to the receivership transfer, the county archives have a note indicating they were taken as part of a personal property inventory, presumably by whoever processed the transfer. By Harlan Voss's team. The hands of her great-great-grandfather's clock, removed and logged as personal property in the final accounting of a theft, as if the time a place kept track of was something that could be taken along with the land. She said, "What time is it now?" Simone checked her watch. 10:47. The clock above them read 10:47. She stood there until 11 o'clock, watching the minute hand move. The Foundation's second grant cycle produced a case that stayed with her longer than the others, though she was careful not to say this out loud because Eleanor had warned her about the particular trap of over-identifying with individual cases at the expense of systemic thinking. The Foundation's work was systemic, Eleanor said. The individual cases were the proof of the system, not the other way around. But this case was different in a way she could not entirely set aside. A woman named Dorothy Briggs, 73 years old, had been fighting for 9 years to recover a 6-acre property in Wilson County that her family had owned since 1938. The land had been taken through a tax lien sale in 2015, a process that was technically legal and practically predatory. The lien had been purchased by a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring tax liens and converting them to ownership through a redemption period mechanism that was designed to move faster than most elderly homeowners on fixed incomes could navigate. Dorothy had been living on the property when the process began. She had been given 45 days to redeem the lien, a timeline that required her to produce $11,000 she did not have, and when the redemption period expired, the equity firm had filed for deed transfer. She had been fighting the transfer process without a lawyer, navigating a legal system that was not designed to be navigated without one for 9 years. The Foundation's grant gave Eleanor's team the resources to take the case on a contingency basis. The legal theory was complicated but solid. The redemption timeline had been calculated incorrectly under state law, giving Dorothy fewer days than she was legally entitled to, and the equity firm's attorneys had known this and had proceeded anyway. Nadia met Dorothy Briggs once, at a Foundation event in April where Eleanor presented the year's grant recipients to a small gathering of the people who had contributed to the Foundation's endowment. Dorothy was a small woman with the particular physical compactness of someone who had been doing manual work her whole life and whose body had organized itself around that fact. She wore a green dress that had been carefully ironed. She shook Nadia's hand and held it for a moment before releasing it. She said, "My grandmother planted peach trees on that land in 1943. 4 of them. They're still there. Every year I drive past and watch them bloom from the road because I can't go onto the property." She paused. She said, "I stopped believing anyone was going to help me about 4 years ago. Then your foundation called." Nadia said, "The trees will still be yours when this is done." Dorothy looked at her steadily. She said, "You know that feeling, don't you? Of having something taken." Nadia said, "I do." Dorothy's case was resolved in August, 12 months after the Foundation's grant. The deed was returned. The legal damages were modest. The equity firm settled for a fraction of what the property's value had grown to in the years since 2015, enough to cover Dorothy's 9 years of pro-SE filing costs with something remaining. Dorothy called Nadia the day the settlement was signed, from the property, from the land itself, standing beside one of the peach trees her grandmother had planted in 1943. The tree was in fruit. She described what it looked like in a voice that moved between steadiness and the edge of something else, and Nadia sat in her room on Eckhart Street with the phone against her ear and let her talk. The Hartwell Rail Yard opened to the public on the second Saturday in October, exactly 1 year after Nadia had run through the flattened fence section in a ripped jacket and electrical tape shoes. The date was not planned to be an anniversary. It simply turned out that way, which felt right. The preservation team had worked with the Tennessee State Historic Preservation Office and a landscape architecture firm that specialized in adaptive reuse, which was the technical term for what they were doing, taking a place that had been built for one purpose and allowing it to serve a different one without pretending the original purpose hadn't existed. The tracks had been cleared and stabilized, the rails restored to a condition that demonstrated their original layout across the full 43 acres. The maintenance shed had been rebuilt on its original footprint using materials that matched the 1920s construction as closely as available materials allowed, the collapsed roof section replaced, the interior fitted to serve as an exhibition hall. The administrative building had been fully restored, the archive room on its second floor now housing a permanent collection of materials documenting the yard's history from 1923 to the present. The boxcar was there. The boxcar would always be there. It had been returned to its position between the two skeleton flat cars at the end of the fourth row, the hidden lock restored, the hatch frame repaired to the condition it had been in before Nadia had pried it open with a length of rebar on an October night. The interior had been preserved exactly as Dr. Asare's team had cataloged it. The shelves, the cases, the hidden partition, the climate-controlled rear chamber, now empty of its contents, but intact in every structural detail. The placard outside the car explained what it was, what it had held, and who had built it. James Earl Cole installed this car's hidden chamber in 1963, the placard read. He chose this method of preservation because he had seen what happened to families who trusted their wealth to institutions that could be pressured or corrupted. He trusted instead in the durability of what he had built himself, and in the conviction that a member of his family would eventually come back to claim what he had left. He was right on both counts. On opening day, the line to enter the maintenance shed exhibition hall stretched the length of the yard. Simone had estimated 400 visitors based on the advance registration numbers. 1,200 people came. They were a cross-section of the city in a way that surprised even Eleanor, who had coordinated the public outreach. School groups, families with children, elderly residents who remembered the yard from its operational years, and who stood at the fence line with expressions of people recognizing something they thought they had lost. A man in his 80s who had worked the yard's night shift from 1968 to 1971 and who wept quietly when he saw the maintenance shed rebuilt and the tracks cleared. A woman who brought a photograph of her father standing in front of the administrative building in 1955, the same photograph reproduced in larger format as part of the exhibition, and her phone out and dialed the number. It rang twice. A man's voice, elderly, careful, with the specific accent of someone who had spent a long life in the Mid-South. "Hello?" she said, "Mr. Cole? This is Nadia." A silence. Then, in a voice that moved between steadiness and the edge of something that had been held back for a long time, "I have been hoping you would call." She sat down on one of the benches along the restored track line. In the afternoon light of the yard her great-great-grandfather had built, and she talked to an old man in Memphis who had been James Cole's youngest brother and who had watched the yard be taken and had been afraid. The same fear that had held her mother back. The same fear that the powerful generated deliberately in people they intended to silence, and who had lived with the guilt of that fear for decades, and who had seen her name in the news and decided, at 81 years old, that it was not too late to say what he should have said 35 years ago. They talked for 47 minutes. He told her things about James Cole she had not found in any archive, not the businessman, not the footnote in a county planning record, but the man. That he had come home from the First World War unable to speak about what he had seen there, but that he had spent the following 5 years working with a focus that his family had understood as his way of putting the war behind him by building something that couldn't be destroyed by it. That he had laughed easily and argued about baseball, and made his wife's birthday cake from scratch every year using a recipe their mother had brought from Georgia. That the yard had been the physical expression of something he believed about what a life was for, not accumulation, but construction. The difference between those two things had mattered enormously to James Cole, and William Cole had never forgotten it. He told her about Robert, her grandfather, quiet, precise, stubborn in the specific way of someone who had inherited a father's determination without inheriting the father's easy warmth that made stubbornness easier to be around. He said Robert had known the loan was wrong from the beginning, but had been convinced by advisors he trusted and had spent the remaining years of his life carrying the knowledge of his own misjudgment on top of the knowledge of the theft. He said Robert had died in 1993, 6 years after filing the objection that was dismissed, 6 years of watching Voss develop the land on the edge of his vision every time he drove that side of the city. He had never stopped believing the documentation he had preserved would someday matter. He had died before he could see it. She told William about the letter from Robert that she had found in case 007, about the letter from her mother, about the October night, the flattened fence, the cold steel under her palm. When she finished, William Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, James always said the right person would find their way back. He said it every time someone tried to tell him the world didn't work that way. He said the yard would wait. She looked at the clock tower. The hands that had been missing for 35 years now showing the actual time, moving the way time moved, the way it had always moved, steady and indifferent to interruption. She said, he was right. William Cole came to Nashville in November. She met him at the station. He did not drive long distances anymore. The train suited him, and she thought James Cole would have approved of his brother arriving in Nashville by rail. He was tall and slightly stooped with age, with the same bone structure she had seen in the 1923 groundbreaking photograph, the same quality of attention in the eyes that she had spent months trying to read in that old image, and now, seeing it in a living face, finally understood. It was not pride, and it was not triumph. It was presence. The quality of someone who looked at what was in front of them and saw it clearly and understood that seeing it clearly was enough, that the thing didn't need to be made into more than it was to be worth standing in front of. He walked the full perimeter of the yard the way she had, slowly, stopping at each structure, running his hand along the track rail the way she had pressed her palm against the side of the freight car on that first night. At the administrative building, he looked up at the clock for a long time without speaking. Then he said, James wound that clock himself every Sunday morning. He said it was the only thing he did on Sundays. Everything else could wait. She stood beside him and looked up at the hands moving. She said, it ran for 53 years without a major failure. He said, that sounds about right. They went inside and she showed him the exhibition, the photographs, the documents. He stood in front of the 1923 groundbreaking photograph for a while, his hands clasped behind his back, and she stood beside him, and they looked at the young man with the ceremonial shovel together. Two people with the same blood, separated by decades and distance, and the specific kind of fear that powerful people generated as a deliberate strategy, standing in the same place at last. She had a family. It was small, one elderly great-great-uncle and whatever connections he led to, and it had arrived late, and under circumstances no one would have designed, and it carried the full history of everything that had been lost and taken and held in the dark waiting to be recovered. But it was real, and it was hers, and she was not the last of anything. The peach trees on Dorothy Briggs's land in Wilson County bloomed in April. Dorothy sent a photograph to the foundation's office, 4 trees in full flower, white against a gray Tennessee sky, exactly as her grandmother, who stood between the two images for a long time. Nadia stood at the entrance for most of the morning, meeting people as they arrived. She had not planned a speech. Eleanor had offered to arrange one, and Nadia had said no, that the exhibition said everything that needed to be said about the history, and that anything she added should be conversation rather than performance. So she stood at the entrance and talked to people as they came in, which was, she thought, what her great-great-grandfather would have done, stood at the entrance of the thing he'd built and been present in it rather than elevated above it. A man came through the entrance in the early afternoon who stopped when he saw her and looked at her with recognition she didn't immediately understand. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, wearing a work jacket over a flannel shirt. He said, "You're the Cole girl." She said, "I am." He said, "I'm Dale Murchison. I was the one checking the lock." She had not known his name. She had known someone was checking the lock, had heard his footsteps that second night, and seen his headlights sweep through the hatch gap, had concluded from the maintenance log that this was a routine performed by a single person over a period of years. She had assumed, when the legal process was underway, that he was a Voss employee acting on instructions, performing a check he had been assigned without necessarily understanding what he was protecting. She looked at him. He said, "I worked for Voss Development for 12 years. I was property maintenance manager. Part of my job was driving the yard check every 6 to 8 weeks, making sure the lock on that car was intact, making sure nobody had got in. I never knew what was inside. I was told it was confidential company assets and my job was to verify the lock and report. That was all." He paused. He said, "When the story came out, I looked at the dates. I was there 10 days before you found it. If I'd been on a shorter schedule, if I'd come back in 3 weeks instead of 6, I'd have found the hatch." She said, "But you didn't." He said, "I didn't." He looked at the yard around them, the cleared tracks, the rebuilt maintenance shed, the administrative building with its clock. He said, "I quit the day after the filing. I should have quit a long time before that. I didn't know about the fraud, but I knew something wasn't right about a lot of what Voss did, and I chose not to look at it too closely for too long." He looked back at her. "I came today because I thought I owed you that. Saying that to your face." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Thank you for coming." He nodded, once, and went inside. She thought about him for a while afterward, the man who had been checking the lock for years, protecting an asset he didn't understand for an employer he eventually recognized was wrong, who had come to a public opening on a Saturday and waited in line to say something she could have chosen not to hear. That was not nothing. Most people in his position would have stayed home and kept the quiet that had kept them comfortable. He had driven across the city and waited in line and said it to her face. She thought this was, in its small and specific way, exactly the kind of thing the Foundation existed to make possible, not the grandiose version, not the court victories and the settlement numbers, but the smaller reckonings, the individual people deciding to stop looking the other way. That was what systemic change was made of underneath the structural work. People choosing differently than they had before, in the ordinary moments when no one was making them. Eleanor found her near the end of the afternoon, when the crowds had thinned to the comfortable late-day movement of people finishing their visits, lingering over the exhibition materials, sitting on the benches the landscape team had installed along the restored track line. She handed Nadia a small envelope. "It came in the Foundation mail this week. I thought you'd want it today rather than Monday." The envelope was addressed to the James Earl Cole Foundation, care of Tennessee Civil Justice Foundation. The handwriting was elderly, deliberate, slightly stiff, the penmanship of someone who had learned it in a different era. The return address was a street in Memphis. Inside was a single index card. On it, in the same elderly handwriting, "My name is William Cole. I believe I am your grandfather's brother. I have been following the news. I would very much like to speak with you if you are willing. A phone number, area code 901. Nadia stood in the middle of the Hartwell Rail Yard in October afternoon light, holding an index card from a man in Memphis who believed he was her family, and felt the particular weight of a story that was not, after all, finished. She had assumed she was the last of them. The sole heir, as the legal documents described her, the last member of the Cole line identifiable in the available records, the only surviving claim to what James Earl Cole had built and Robert Cole had documented and Lisa Cole had pointed toward in a letter written to a child who might never find her way back. Sole heir had felt, in the legal context, like a neutral designation, a fact about inheritance structures. It had also felt, in the quieter hours, like confirmation of something she had believed about herself since she was 6 years old, sitting on a kitchen floor. That she was alone in the particular way of someone who came from nowhere and would eventually go back there. She turned the index card over. On the back, in the same careful handwriting, a single additional line. "James was my brother. I should have looked for you sooner. I am sorry I did not." She put the card back in its envelope and held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Then she had planted them in 1943. Eleanor printed it and put it on the wall of the conference room where the grants committee met, beside the map of the state with the counties marked where the Foundation had active cases. The Foundation funded 23 cases in its first full year of operation. 19 of them resolved in the claimant's favor. The other 4 were ongoing. Eleanor projected the second year would see 40 cases. The year after that, 60. The endowment was structured to sustain this growth across a 20-year horizon, and Eleanor and Nadia had agreed that the 20-year point would be a reassessment whether the systemic problem they were addressing had changed enough to require different responses, or whether the same fight was still the one worth fighting. Eleanor had said, "It will still be the same fight." Nadia had said, "Probably. But let's check." On a Friday morning in late April, Nadia walked through the Hartwell Rail Yard alone, as she did most Friday mornings, partly for the habit of it, and partly because the yard was quiet on weekday mornings, the school groups not arriving until midweek, the weekend crowds still 2 days away, and the space had a quality in that particular stillness that she had not found anywhere else in the city. The quality of a place that had been through something and had come out of it not unchanged but intact. The specific peace that was different from the peace of places that had never been tested. She walked the 4th row. She stopped at the boxcar between the 2 skeleton flat cars. She did not go in, she never went in anymore, the interior being part of the public exhibition, and she had said what she needed to say to that space in the months when it was still just hers, and she was still figuring out what it meant. But she stopped in front of it and looked at it the way she always did. The exterior, the disguised lock, the hatch frame, repaired and painted, that she had pried open with a piece of rebar on an October night when she had $62 in her pocket and nowhere else to go. She put her hand flat against the steel side of the car. The cold was there. Always there, the sealed interior, the preserved chamber, even now with the financial instruments gone and the cases relocated to the archive, and the only thing behind the partition being the structural evidence of what it had been. The cold was not the contents. The cold was the space itself, the sealed and maintained darkness, the refusal to let time in. She held her palm against the steel and felt it. Then she took her hand away and walked on. The clock tower was visible from the far end of the yard, the hands moving in the April morning light, keeping the actual time as it always had, interrupted for 35 years and then resumed, without apology, without drama, the way things resumed when the thing that had stopped them was finally and correctly addressed. She had $913 in the savings account she had not touched. She had a room on Eckhart Street and a great-great-uncle in Memphis and an attorney who was also, quietly, a friend and a foundation that was going to keep going after she was gone, the same way the yard was going to keep going, the same way the clock was going to keep going, not because anyone was watching, but because the mechanism had been built right and the hands had been put back and there was nothing left to stop it. She walked through the yard in the April morning and let the hands move. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.